Please welcome to the stage Meg Szabo, Senior Editor for Bloomberg Green and Sustainability Events.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. We are thrilled to be hosting you here for our Sustainable Business Summit in our London office. We have a great program ahead focused on innovative ideas and scalable solutions to help you meet your sustainability goals. But before we get started, a couple of quick announcements. First, I would like to acknowledge our summit advisors, EY, Red Sea Global, and Schneider Electric. We would love to hear from you today. You can find the Wi-Fi information on the back of your badge. If you'd like to submit questions to our speakers or respond to any of our polls today, you can use that QR code that's on the screen behind me. And we would love to hear from you on social media using the hashtag #SustainableBizSummit. And with that, let's please get started. I have had the pleasure of introducing many speakers, but it is my distinct honor to introduce this next one. He is the founder of Bloomberg and Bloomberg Philanthropies, and he is the one that makes this all possible. Please join me in welcoming Michael R. Bloomberg.
Meg, thank you for that. The fact that you get your paycheck from us had nothing to do with the kind introduction, I trust. Nobody's ever gotten up and said, this guy's a terrible speaker. I'm sorry I had to introduce him, but I need the money to feed my kids. Anyways, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg's European headquarters. I'm glad to say that this building was rated the most sustainable building in the world when it opened in 2017. Norman Foster designed the building. I happened to have dinner with him last night. He is absolutely brilliant, and he really does care about the environment and all of his buildings to make sure that they're as good as they can be while servicing the people who aren't going to work in there or live in his buildings. And it was good to have be on the team with him. So welcome to the building. It's a great place to host all of you today. And also the commute from my desk was very easy. Just up one ramp, and I might point out it was zero carbon. So you can do some things right. Anyways, we've assembled a group of over 200 innovators from both business and finance, hailing from 20 different countries. And so to all of you and to the business leaders and investors attending virtually from around the world, thank you for your business and thank you for joining us today. We are all here and we're all focused on sustainability. We can't miss it. In our world, we talk about it all the time. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people in the world who don't focus on sustainability, and they're about to find out just how bad things are going to get. If you take a look at the heat waves that are going across America now, but also places like India and China, where it's getting to the point where you just cannot literally go outside. People are going to get a wake-up call, and hopefully they'll join the challenge that we have and do something about it. We want the planet to survive, and we want our companies to thrive, and you can certainly do both. You just have to be intelligent about it and train your resources to where they will do the most good. We're all looking to reduce costs. We're all looking to reduce energy usage and getting more of it from clean sources. And we're looking to reduce the very real financial risks posed by climate change, which are growing by the day alongside the worst of its impacts. We did get a vivid reminder of the harms that in New York this month. I don't know if you saw the photos, but it looked like something out of a science fiction movie. You'd look out and it wasn't that the sky was red. The air looking across the street was red, and you could see these tiny particles in the air. And it was all of the forest fires in Canada that blown down and across that part of the United States. It was a weird reddish orange, and it made the quality of air in New York the worst city in the world for a couple of days. And, you know, we in New York think, oh, there's nothing, that we don't pollute that much. It's a big city, but there's lots of air going through. The start of the Canadian wildfire season is unprecedented, and unfortunately, it's just the latest example of worsening climate change. When you talk to farmers across the middle of the country in America, they are furious because the Canadians are now growing the crops that they have had an exclusive ability to grow before. All of a sudden, it really is much warmer up there. All of a sudden, you can do different things there. And some of the things that they've been growing will no longer grow in the United States. When you turn on the television or just look outside your window, you can see these forest fires, you can see the droughts, you can see the storms and floods getting more extreme and more costly. And then you look on television and there's people who say, oh, climate change is a fake thing. It's just done by a few activists who are cuckoo, and they just don't seem to understand. But their houses are going to be flooded if they live near the ocean. The crops that they buy in the form of processed foods are going to cost a lot more or not be available. And they're going to have to change their lives, and it's going to catch up. It would be a lot better if it caught up to them earlier rather than later, but whatever it is. We really don't have a moment to waste, and when it comes to accelerating the global transition away from fossil fuels and towards clean energy, we've got to do it right now. Now, the good news is some of us are doing it that way, and we're doing it faster every day, and I'm glad that you are stepping up to help and setting increasingly ambitious clean energy goals. At Bloomberg, we're trying to lead by example, and nearly 55% of our global electricity is now sourced from renewable energy projects, and we're on track to meet our goal of 100% by 2025. So a year and a half from now, we should be there. Also, you should know that nearly all of the profits of this company go to Bloomberg Philanthropies, our philanthropic arm, which funds clean air and clean energy initiatives around the world, including close partnerships with national governments across Africa and Asia and Latin America. And now climate change is far too big to challenge for governments to tackle alone. I'm, after having been in government for a number of years, very skeptical about what they do and how serious they are. They talk a good game, but in all fairness, they don't do anywhere near as much as the private sector can do. And we've just got to make sure that the private sector understands that they should do it and get them to do it. And if you're an employee of a company, we are trying to urge you to call your boss and say, I want to work for a company that is friendly to the environment because my kids are at home, I'm working to support them, but I want them to breathe clean air. And more and more, what we've done through sponsoring the Sierra Club in the United States and some organizations over here in Europe, we've got these organizations to lobby the companies as investors in those companies, as employees of those companies, as customers of those companies, and say, we are not going to buy your product, work there, invest in you, unless you do something to help me make sure that my family has a future. And the results of that are, in America, we've closed or in the process of closing 70% of all the coal-fired power plants. And in Europe, 50%. And we're still going strong. And I think we can get to our goal of eventually getting rid of the dependency on coal. Then methane is the next thing you've got to worry about. But we just can't sit back, and I'm happy to say Bloomberg is not sitting back. And those of you who are customers of ours, maybe it'll put a smile on your face to know that the monies that you pay us for our products, and I hope you do more of that, are giving us the ability to maybe change the world. We are bringing more data and more transparency to our efforts every day. For example, the United Nations Climate Conference, COP28, is coming up, and we took a big step at last year's COP in Egypt. We joined French President Macron in announcing recommendations for a new public data portal, and now together we're working to build it. And for the first time, that portal will bring together accurate corporate climate-related data in one place and also make it available to the public. And we think that that will empower decision makers with the information they need to act and to hold companies accountable for making good on their climate promises. We're happy to harness the power of the markets too, and more than 550 financial institutions from over 50 countries have joined the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, or GFANZ as we call it, an organization that Mark Carney, the former head of the Bank of England, chairs. And I think I'm co-chair with him, but he's the one that deserves the credit. He's the one that's doing the work. And he's gotten the members of the coalition to produce plans for moving their entire portfolios to net zero. It's complicated work, but a growing number are getting it done, and I'm glad to say that includes our next speaker. Allison Rose is the CEO of NatWest. If you want to give some business to another bank, it might be nice to throw her company some business if they're doing the right thing. If you reward companies that are doing the right thing by giving them more business, you encourage them to do more, and we should say thank you to those companies. She helps lead the strategy for GFANZ as part of its principals group, and I've had a chance to talk to her a few minutes ago, and I'm glad you have a chance to hear from her now. So please join me in welcoming in conversation with Anna Edwards of Bloomberg, Allison Rose. Allison and Anna, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for that introduction. My name is Anna Edwards. I work for Bloomberg at Bloomberg TV, and it is a real pleasure to be joined by Allison for this conversation this morning. So thank you very much for joining us. And we'll dive right in. We'll talk about your commitment to sustainability at NatWest and what you're doing and what you're learning, what you're bringing. If we start with the role of leadership in this, we just heard Michael's words, Mike Bloomberg's words on what he thinks is important in terms of leading the business I work for. I wonder how you make sure that you set the right tone, that the message you want to communicate to your staff really gets through.
Yeah, I mean, we've been very clear that the climate emergency is the biggest challenge that we're going to face, and as a bank and the leading bank in the UK, we have a real role to play with where finance goes and what we do. But we've made it strategic. I think how you communicate to your employees and make it clear. This isn't a sustainability project on the side. The climate transition is a core part of our strategy. It is embedded in all of our targets to the market. It's embedded in our remuneration. It's embedded right the way through the organization. And we've been very clear that what we want to do is get our own house in order, to end harmful activity, and to fund and finance the transition to net zero and build powerful partnerships. So we're very clear on the strategy, and it's embedded right the way through our organisation.
Okay, so embedding it, not keeping it sustainability project on the side is important. You're heavily involved, clearly, we'll talk about what your business is doing with the climate transition plan, but you're also involved in a UK task force around climate and GFANZ. Mike Bloomberg was just referencing your commitment there. So interesting to get your assessment of what kind of momentum you think the climate movement has towards COP28. A global stock take at the end of this year in the UAE. How would you mark the scorecard?
We're falling behind globally. It's complicated, but it's imperative. I mean, I don't talk about it about climate transition. I talk about it as climate emergency. And this isn't going to happen unless the public and private sector come together in order to drive this change. I think there is really good momentum that we've driven. You know, GFANZ, of which I'm a founding member, huge amounts of private sector money, huge mobilization, real change and real drive. But it is at the practical level. How do you get those public and private sector partnerships? And fundamentally, it's about the targets. You know, the world is heating up. It has really broad implications, and we need to make the movement. So the stock take is great, but actually the momentum. And I think one of the really important things is we don't have the luxury of waiting. As someone in a PLC where I've set really clear targets, I'm accountable to the board and my investors and, you know, all that scrutiny. We don't have the luxury of waiting for perfect data. We've got to get going. We've got to keep moving, and sitting on the sidelines and waiting isn't good enough. Okay. We've got to keep going.
So 7 years from Paris and 7 years to 2030, where a lot of countries have goals, including the UK has important goals around 2030. A step up in momentum is needed.
Step up in momentum is needed, and more alignment between public and private sector. This is not something that one country, one organisation can do on its own. We really need that alignment between public and private, and that's where, you know, particularly we focused on those public-private partnerships to unlock and put practical help in the hands of people. One of the things I think we forget is for big organizations and at a country level, you have huge amounts of data, you have huge amounts of resource. If you're an SME running a small business, you don't have the resource to measure your data or look into your supply chain. If you're an individual home buyer, you need information to help you do it and choices. We have to address the whole system, not just at the top level.
And so let's talk about what NatWest is doing. Your climate transition plan released, I think, in February, it gave a sort of sector by sector detailed breakdown of your aim to halve emissions from the companies and businesses that you finance by 2030. So that's your 2030 commitment. I mean, that's talking scope 3, isn't it? That's not your emissions, it's the emissions of the businesses that you serve. Are you concerned that you might not have the tools to influence what they're doing?
So, I mean, we're one of the very few banks that have science-based targets. So exactly, this is our scope 3. I think what we have to do is put the tools in the hands of our customers and then direct our financing in order to enable to do that. So it's not one thing that you can do, it's really the tools. So for SMEs, who in the UK represent 50% of the turnover of this country and 60% of the employees, it's putting in their hands things like Carbon Planner, which is a digital tool that helps them measure their supply chain, and then we can put cheaper finance in their hands to make the transition. It's the consumer on the high street where we have an app called Kogo with a fintech we partnered with, which measures as they buy what their carbon footprint is, what the impact is. And it's everyone making those small steps. But it's tough for people. There is still a green premium. There is still a gap. It still costs money. And so what we have to do is make sure we give them the information, the tools, and the financing, and then get the public and private sector to work together.
Okay.
A great example, just to give one, farming is, Mike mentioned it, agriculture sector in the UK represents 10% of the carbon emissions in the UK. It's 20% of the emissions on my book. We are not going to stop lending to farmers, but productivity and sustainability are not mutually exclusive. So we're working with farmers to help them finance the transition, to give them tools and data, to help them invest for more renewable financing and make that transition. And that's the real level of practical steps you have to make in order to make the full movement.
Okay, so that's what you're doing, and that's an interesting example around agriculture and the different goals you're setting around different sectors. Let's talk about oil and gas then, and what you do with that sector. I understand that you're stopping offering loans to new customers in the oil and gas area, phasing out such loans for continuing customers, but no hard stop. Do you think that's the right balance then between what you want to do for the climate and what you want to do to ensure transition?
Yeah, and I think this comes down to, we've got very clear policies on oil and gas. So oil and gas lending is only 0.7% of my balance sheet. We will only work with oil and gas companies who have a credible transition plan aligned to Paris. So we're working with them, and a lot of the oil and gas companies are funding some of the renewable, some of the capital extension. Coal we're phasing out. Our exposure to coal, 3 years ago was 600 million, it's 300 million, it will be phased out. And we're not doing any new lending, as we said. So I think making sure we fund the transition, and an important aspect of this is we also need to make sure that we're transitioning the whole sector and not exclude, from a socio-economic perspective, people who can't afford to transition. So we're being really robust on the data, the disclosure, but making sure it is aligned with Paris. And we've exited over $1 billion of exposure to oil and gas because their transition plans are not good enough. So that's how we're...
So there are companies that, you cut them off, or you...
We no longer lend to them. They have to refinance and we phase out. But what's really important is you don't push the hard-to-abate financing sector out of the regulatory and system, because we want that transparency and disclosure. And there are going to be hard-to-abate sectors, but let's keep them transparent and not in another part of the financing economy that we can't see, because the ultimate goal that we have to keep our eyes on is getting the carbon out of the atmosphere and making sure we're growing new technology, new renewables, enhancing the use of that. So we will finance oil and gas, 0.7% of our balance sheet, only if they have credible transition plans.
So if they have credible transition plans, I mean, one of the criticisms of that approach, I suppose, could be that if you don't fund oil and gas, regardless perhaps of some of their commitments around Paris in the North Sea, that then you're just reliant, you make the country more reliant on imported fuels from other parts of the world, and we have maybe less visibility or insight into climate commitments there. I mean, that might be far away from a bank CEO's mandate, but if you're stepping into this kind of differentiated lending, you put yourself in that conversation.
Well, I think it's an important conversation to be in. Energy security has become, incredibly critical, as has sustainability of our energy supplies. But we have huge amounts of investment in solar and wind, and there are massive amounts of projects that are waiting for approval that we can continue to fund. We need to get access to the grid, we need to invest in getting planning working, we need to get the housing retrofitted. So there's huge amounts we can still do. The UK is a poor performer in adoption of heat pumps, which can make homes more sustainable and more viable. So it is, I think, it's too simplistic to say oil and gas bad, solar good. We've got to say invest and continue to drive solar, to drive wind, to drive renewables, and transition away from oil and gas in a responsible way.
Okay. You've mentioned, we've talked in detail about some of the plans that you have. The government still owns 38%, I think, of NatWest. Does this make any day-to-day difference to the commitments that you have to make around this versus other parts of the banking sector?
No, not at all. I mean, the government are a great shareholder for us. We're very aligned. They would like to not be a shareholder. We would like them not to be a shareholder, that in a very positive, mutually supportive way. But they don't sit on my board. They're not involved in our day-to-day. So this is very much, and they are very supportive of our strategy as a shareholder, of which climate transition, the 100 billion we've committed to fund and finance that, is a core part of our strategy.
You mentioned that you have these SBTIs, so Science-Based Target Initiative, where you're going for approval there.
We are approved.
You are approved?
We are one of the very few global banks where all of our balance sheet and our targets are based on science-based targets, which are signed off.
Okay, and you're also a member of a task force appointed by in the UK around energy efficiency and crucially sit on GFANs, as you've mentioned. Has that wider role outside NatWest, has that really influenced, Alison, the conversations you have around sustainability within the business? Does it help to get that sort of broader perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've always said that the way you will do this is with partnership. You need a line partnership, and of course, being co-chair of the Energy Efficiency Task Force is I can bring more private sector into that partnership with a detailed view of government and the public policy. But we're working really broadly with partners, and I think it is that interlock and unwind that we need so that we can solve this together.
Is that the answer, partnership, is that the answer on retrofitting homes then? Because I know that you've said that this can be done at scale, it's achievable, it can be done affordably, but paid for by whom? Because this seems to still be a real open question, such an ageing housing stock in this country.
Yeah, I mean, the UK has the oldest housing stock. And yes, and there's an enormous opportunity, and I think this is one of the things that really can ignite. If we look at the need to retrofit homes, the transition that the UK can make, there is a £175 billion revenue opportunity for SMEs in this country to be part of that retrofit and transition. 260,000 jobs that can be created, 40,000 new businesses. So as a business commercial opportunity, that is enormous. But we need to create the interlock. It's just too hard for a consumer to decide, I've got to pay for loft insulation or a heat pump. Is that good? Is that bad? Is that
find somebody to fit the heat pump.
Find someone to fit it, to get all of those details. We need to get that interlock between, skilling up more people into the ability to do that, to get it really clear and simple so they know where to go and that the cost of it can be financed in a cheaper way. So one of the things we're building in partnership is a one-stop shop where we're going to bring together the providers, cheaper financing so it doesn't cost you as much, the insight and the data so you can see the benefit that you're getting. And then one of the things we're working on with the Energy Efficiency Task Force with the government is to say, how can you create those right reward incentives to help it be an easy and simple and frictionless decision for someone who's making that about their house.
What progress is the government making on its targets? Because some years ago, the UK seemed to be sort of leading the way in setting ambitious targets, but actually delivering on the smaller scale plans to get to those targets seems a little elusive, and it's faced criticism from many quarters. I saw, there were reports out this morning, but Wildlife Fund, plenty of bodies also criticising the government for being too slow on this.
Yeah, look, it's difficult, but I think we just do need to move faster. I mean, we're partnering with the World Wildlife Fund to work with government and farmers and trade bodies and NGOs to say what is the solution so that we can get out there. And I think the Energy Efficiency Task Force is a great example of how, you know, the government is trying to find how do we get this complicated unlock and this link between public and private so we can really move the money to the right projects to have the biggest impact.
You were talking about moving the money to the right projects. You've also been issuing green bonds.
We have.
What's the market like there? What does demand look like, that experience?
Yeah, look, demand is really good. I mean, reasons to be optimistic. I mean, we've got a terrible challenge, but reasons to be optimistic. I mean, less than 18 months ago, I made a statement to commit £100 billion to fund and finance the transition through the issuing of green bonds, which is part of that. We've already delivered 40 billion, you know, in a relatively short period of time. So the demand is there. We're seeing huge demand for green bonds, for infrastructure finance, demand from companies to refinance their supply chain and work in partnership. So it is there. We've just got to make it easier and more accessible and move faster.
We've talked a lot about climate, and sustainability, of course, comes in many forms. Also, social bonds. You've been issuing those, I think, in March. You issued a social bond linked to women-led enterprises, which provides new loans, new financing to those enterprises. What caps demand for that sort of project, whether it's green bonds or social bonds? How does the market look?
Yeah, look, I mean, we managed to raise, 500 million for the female entrepreneurship bonds. I mean, female entrepreneurship in the UK is a massive opportunity. Some of the research I did as part of the Rose Review identified there's a 250 billion revenue opportunity for the economy if we can get access to funding, and women starting and scaling businesses is the same as other high-performing countries. We're seeing record number of young women starting businesses. So in the 16 to 24-year-old age group, it's almost tenfold increase in 3 years. So the more women that start businesses, the more SME, the more lending we can provide. We can package those bonds, sell them, and then reinvest them. We also raised a £1 billion bond for investment in social housing, and we've also the green bonds that we've done. So the demand is there. It's packaging the assets and making sure that we can deliver them, and that's a core part of how I'm shaping my balance sheet and lending.
Okay, and none of this sustainability conversation happens in a vacuum, of course. It happens against an economic backdrop, which maybe we'll spend a moment just thinking about. I know the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, has been meeting with all kinds of sectors to try and see what they can do about the cost of living crisis in the UK. And you clearly want to invest in technologies that make it easier for your clients to be greener, but at the same time, you're under pressure to increase rates on savings accounts. What is that conversation like with government at the moment?
Look, I mean, I think at the moment you're in, the economic dynamic of wrestling inflation to the ground is a really difficult problem, and that's eating into people's disposable income, and interest rates are going up. So there are real challenges of cost of living, and anxiety is, for a lot of people, they've never faced a rising rate or inflationary environment. So, my job is to support our customers through tough times as well as good times, but also build long-term sustainable value. So we're putting lots of measures, funding in to the lower decile households, because those are the ones who are feeling the real strain. So when you talk about cost of living, lots of anxiety for customers of rising rates, come and talk to your bank. We have huge amounts of support we can give you. Help people save. People have got out of the saving habit, so we have, digital regular saver accounts paying 6% to help people save. You can get 5% interest rate on your savings accounts.
And do savers tell you they want more?
No,
in a rising rate environment?
Well, actually, what you have in the UK is 85% of our customers have less than £5,000 saving in their account. 1 in 4 people have never saved money in the first place and have less than £100 saving. So actually, we need to make sure we're passing on rates to help people, that we're helping those lower decile income households who, by the way, don't have a mortgage and don't have any savings, and where cost of living is really causing a crisis, and that's where we need to help. And then we have to help people transition through this period.
So that's the focus for the business around those who really struggling at this point. What about those mortgage borrowers? Then I appreciate not everybody has a mortgage, but what about the mortgage borrowers? How many do you think of your NatWest customers? What's the latest thinking of those who are going to miss payments and therefore be eligible for these government schemes that are being talked about? 12 months grace period on your mortgage, or going to interest only, those type of things.
Yeah, well, what you can see from the so we're helping our customers as they come off fixed rates to find a new mortgage and all of that support. What you are actually seeing is at arrears level, so people who are missing payments or in trouble, is less than sort of 0.4% of our book. If you look at the Bank of England data, 0.5% of people are in arrears. Pre-COVID, that was 3.29%. So people who are in genuine distress and can't make their mortgage repayments, there is huge amounts of help out there.
Yeah.
Actually, what you're really seeing at the moment is people are facing the impact of coming off lower rates onto higher rates and their disposable income being squeezed. And that's where we're putting all of that support in place. So the arrears level are at super low levels, still below pre-COVID levels, but anxiety is really high. And that's where there's lots of support. Come and talk to your bank. They will help you with lots of different measures. We have something called a free financial health check, where we bring everyone's balance sheet together and say, okay, what are your different options? How can we help? 9 times out of 10, we save people money.
And what do you expect to happen to the UK mortgage market with all of this in mind, the rate at which we've seen these rates go higher?
Well, the mortgage market is much smaller this year. We always said it would be much lower. And really what you're talking about is a remortgage market as people come off mortgages. We're seeing, if I think about our book, over 75% of our customers are on 5-year fixed rate. So people are coming off their fixed rate and looking for new deals and then sort of trying to decide what to do. So I think lower volume, you are seeing house prices drop, you are seeing people, actually consumers behaving really rationally. They're adjusting their spending to deal with the sort of inflationary environments, and then we're working really closely with them to help them find the right deal for them.
Okay, Alison, thank you so much. Thank you very much for joining us. Alison Rose.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Ben Backwell, CEO of the Global Wind Energy Council, and Cecilia Tam, Senior Investment Analyst at the International Energy Agency, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Lizzie Burden.
Hello, everyone. Ben, Cecilia, thanks so much for joining me. I know we've got a wind expert on the panel, but I'll try and keep the hot air to a minimum. I want to start really big. Cecilia, the Inflation Reduction Act, threat or opportunity?
At the IEA, we see this really as an opportunity. If we're looking at some of the IEA scenarios that call for a major transition in the way we produce and consume energy, we really need to see ambitious programs and supports from every country. And I think the shift that we've seen in the US and the ambitious support for climate action for the transition, we see this really as an opportunity. It could be an opportunity to further drive down costs that will be really critical in terms of achieving the global energy transition.
And Ben, in terms of the European response and the UK's response, putting Brexit aside, how can they work together in coming back to the Inflation Reduction Act?
Well, first of all, and thanks, Lizzie, and good morning to everyone. The US, I mean, we definitely see it as an opportunity. We definitely see it as something the rest of the world needs to respond to. And we can see governments everywhere kind of looking at how they're responding. They're scrambling to respond, and we think that's a good thing. The US now has certainty for 10 years. They will double their wind capacity in the next 7 years because of the IRA. We've seen a huge jump in new facilities being announced in the US in manufacturing, huge demand for grid connections. We, frankly, are waiting for the response from Europe still, I think. So the Net Zero Industry Act, which was announced earlier this year, I think is a start. And it contains a lot of very helpful provisions to try and get the market going, particularly around things like permitting. But there's no real equivalent to the IRA in terms of support for manufacturing, and also in terms of actually creating financial incentives for the industry. And I think that's the key thing that's missing. So there's a lot of new kind of demands, in a way, for local manufacturing, but there's not a lot of financial incentive to actually make the industry profitable. And I think that's the difference in the IRA. There's a direct effect on people's IRR, whereas in Europe, that's not really clear where that comes from.
So I just want to put this into context, and I think our magical helpers have got a chart to show you of the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act and just how much investment it's brought about in terms of the US. Cecilia, when it comes to the UK particularly, there are lots of warnings about how the response could turn into a trade war. Is that just an excuse because there are actually huge fiscal constraints?
I mean, I don't know about that. I think if we look at where we need to go in the transition, we really need all countries to act in terms of investing in more low carbon technologies. Our analysis shows that these commitments and these announcements of government support, including the RA, but in countries also like Europe, India, China, we will really only be meeting the announced policy scenarios of the IEA's outlooks. Where we need to go to achieve the Paris commitment and address climate change is our net zero emission scenario. And if you look at the amount of investments that are going to be required for that, we still have, I think, tremendous growth for manufacturing around the world. So we would like to see this less of issues around trade conflicts, but really investing in opportunities for expanding the energy transition. And I think we should see the RA as an opportunity, and countries should look at how they can collaborate more to drive down costs and support more global manufacturing in these clean energy technologies that we're going to need around the world.
But then, Ben, how do you stop the Inflation Reduction Act just sucking investment out of places like Brazil, for example?
Yeah, I think, that is one, important issue. Nearly all the investment last year that went into clean energy transition and manufacturing in particular was in either the developed countries or China. And I think that's a very, very big deficit, both from a material point of view of getting the transition done in developing countries, but also from a political and social point of view. There has to be something in this for all these countries. There has to be something in this for Africa, for Southeast Asia, for Latin America. And there is a danger, not so much that investors will leave these markets and go to the US, but certainly when multinational companies are making their investment decisions, the US will be a very, very attractive market to go to. And we've seen that already with some battery companies that have decided to go to the US rather than to other jurisdictions. And I couldn't agree more with what Cecilia said, which is that we need we need everyone. This is a huge step up. We're talking about just for the wind sector, something like 4 times as much in terms of annual installations by the time we get to 2030. In the IEA's net zero by 2050 scenario, wind goes to, 8.3 terawatts. We've just passed the first terawatt a couple of weeks ago. So we need to go basically 8 times bigger by 2050. And if you do the numbers, that means we should be installing 3 to 4 times as much every year, which is in line with what the COP presidency is calling for at the moment, right? So we're going to need everybody and all of everything we've got right now and a lot more to get there. And it's quite worrying that we're focused on trade wars, protectionism and all these issues, when in fact we need a massive scaling up of manufacturing capacity and a massive scaling up of collaboration across the world.
Okay, so now we know what the goals are. I've got a poll for everyone in the audience to see what the biggest barriers to getting there are. So the question is, what could become the biggest barrier to EU industrial competitiveness in the green transition? A lack of funding from Brussels, failure to harness global talent, economic imbalances among member states, or confusing regulatory regimes? And we'll come back to the answer later on. And I hope you'll both have a think about what your view would be on that. Also, just to remind you, if you're in the audience, that you can send in your questions using the QR code, and hopefully we'll have time to come to those at the end as well. You mentioned China, Ben. Cecilia, let me ask you, can the West actually catch up with China's clean energy manufacturing might?
I think if you look at costs in China, the strength it has in terms of critical minerals, it's a big challenge to have an objective to try to catch up to China. And I think it's less about, as Ben said, about competing issues of trade wars or protectionism, but looking at the opportunity to transition markets. So countries that are putting in place green industrial policies should really look at where they have an added advantage and worry less about, can we catch up to China? They should really be looking at, in this opportunity of the global energy transition, where does it make more sense for us to compete? And I think you see different countries identifying their strengths based on their national resources. And it's less about trying to compete in all areas, but finding where we, as a manufacturer, as a country, have an added advantage in the whole transition. Because I think, as Ben said, and as our IEA scenarios show, the multiples of growth that we need to see in investments in manufacturing are so large that the business opportunities are enormous for everyone. And it's less, I think, about trying to compete with each other, but really getting those investments in place, moving forward with the transitions, and being able to actually keep pace with the investments that we need to put in.
But we're obviously in an inflation crisis. Ben, how much more expensive will the energy transition be if we're moving away from cheap Chinese manufacturing? How concerned are you about the inflationary impact of the green transition?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's really important to have diverse supply chains. We can't depend on one particular country, and I think that's entirely logical and was a consequence a little bit of the pandemic to kind of see those vulnerabilities, right? And we'd like to see, obviously, everybody getting local jobs and manufacturing opportunities from the transition. So I think that's a good thing. Now, in terms of cost, right? We need to be quite careful. As an industry, we've been used to having these constantly declining costs all the time, right? And the expectations of international institutions and governments, and even people like Bloomberg NEF, is that costs will continually decline. Now, our costs are probably almost 20% higher than they were before the pandemic. It's actually a reversal over the last few years, and that's because of much higher raw material costs. For steel, there was a big crisis around logistics. There's now higher financing costs as well. So we shouldn't assume that the energy transition is just going to keep getting cheaper and cheaper. So we have to be quite careful. We can't massively scale up and introduce more sustainability and circularity and try and do it all on our own in different regions and countries and expect things to still keep getting cheaper. And I think there's often a kind of disconnect as well between treasury departments in countries and departments which are looking at the energy transition and wider policy. Treasury departments are still focused on trying to force down prices any way they can, and we have all these kind of single, price auctions around the world where they're just trying to force down prices, and then you get to a kind of race to the bottom pricing where companies can't actually make any money. And that's, we've seen that happen a lot over the last few years, and as a result of that, companies are losing money when they should be making money. Just to finish, if you try and do all of that all at the same time, without doubt, the energy transition is going to be more expensive. Now, given that we're far more competitive than fossil fuels, there is a certain room for manoeuvre, but I think we have to be quite careful about costs.
But so that's the fiscal side, and even there you're saying it's not always joined up. But Cecilia, what about the role for central banks? The hiking interest rates again and again and again. Do they risk derailing the green energy transition by making investment more expensive?
I think this is, the role of central banks in terms of energy transitions is going to be about trying to incentivize more investments in the transition itself. Higher interest rates.
Would you go as far as Megan Green's suggestion for a dual interest rate, maybe a negative preferential interest rate for green investment?
I don't know if that's necessarily the role of the central banks to put that in place. I think this will come down to country incentives for encouraging investments in the sectors itself. This can be done through the central bank's energy interest rate policies, but more often than not, it's going to be done through industrial policy implementation. But it's true that higher interest rates will make the cost of the transition more expensive. But I think we can set in place financial regulation that will make it more attractive to invest in sustainable technology. And what we need to do is put in place stronger signals that we need to stop investing in fossil. So how can we really use financial market and fiscal policies to steer away from fossil fuel investments and more towards clean energy technologies?
So, Ben, what would you do in terms of those other incentives, especially when it comes to monetary policy? Do you agree with Megan Green? I should say she's the incoming member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee.
Look, I definitely think we need to get creative about how we do things and how we incentivize things, and business as usual is not going to get us to where we are. So I think it's a valid discussion in terms of making sure the financing is competitive.
What does that look like in terms of monetary policy?
That's kind of way above my pay grade, really, Lizzie.
Well, let me ask you on wind then. One of the biggest wind turbine suppliers announced they're going to lose over €1 billion to fix faulty turbines just last week. It's the latest setback for the wind industry. We've had years of losses, rising costs. Is wind power at risk of becoming uninvestable?
No, I mean, definitely no, it's not at risk of becoming uninvestable. But unfortunately, we've had this very kind of perverse paradoxical situation in the last few years where companies which are really at the heart of the energy transition, and the technology that's at the heart of the energy transition is the best way of taking out carbon from the power system per megawatt. Unfortunately, a lot of the companies can't make any money. And I think we need to look at the market and how it works. And again, as I said, I mean, we've driven renewables pricing to the floor for both wind and solar, actually. Whereas at the same time, the fossil fuel industry has been making record profits and reaping these windfall profits. And there's clearly something wrong there. We're not giving the investment signal to the companies for the renewable energy transition. So things need to be fixed. We need to stop talking about making renewables cheaper. We're already far cheaper than fossil fuels. And you can see in Bloomberg's LCOE figures that came out a few weeks ago, we are half the rate of fossil fuels in terms of average. So why should we be selling power at half the rate of fossil fuel? There's something wrong there and it needs to be fixed.
I like that. I didn't even ask you to cite Bloomberg figures, and yet you've done it for me. I think we've got some time for some questions from the audience. Has Meg got those for us? We'll come back to that. We can, though, do the answers to the poll. So we asked, what could become the biggest barrier to EU industrial competitiveness in the green transition? And you said, which we will put on the screen now. My magic powers just aren't working today. Okay, confusing regulatory regimes, 67%, economic imbalances, 15%, lack of funding from Brussels, 11%, and failure to harness global talent, 7%. Would you agree with that?
I would. I was going to vote for the first one as well.
Ben?
I would.
Do we have Meg? Okay. Let me ask you then, what other levers should countries be pulling to make the money go further, the money that governments are giving them? Could the funds be used in a better way to improve uptake, Cecilia?
I mean, I think one thing we haven't really talked about is when we talk about a global clean energy transition, how we can support emerging and developing economies. Because if you look at all of the forecasts of where investments need to go and where we're falling behind, our numbers show that about 90% of all of the clean energy investments have gone to advanced economies in China. Mm-hmm. We've seen some, areas of positive in countries like India and Brazil, but still too little is being spent in countries in Africa, for example, in parts of Asia. And if we really want to address sustainability, climate change, global warming, we really need to support these less developed countries in their transitions. And I think as an international community, we also need to not just think about domestic growth, but also how do we support broader transitions? Because it goes back to the discussion of the need to take advantage of opportunities to collaborate, to see broader benefits. Because if you look at manufacturing, you get much lower costs in manufacturing in developing economies than developed. And driving down costs of different technologies will have positive benefits around the world. So, working together closer on supporting transitions, not just in our own markets, but I think in major developing economies is an area that we need to spend more attention on.
And Ben, how do you make the investment case easier in Africa, for example, when you've got a big package like the Inflation Reduction Act to compete with?
I think Africa, is a special case in itself in a way, in that, continent, huge, growing population, amazing talent, huge demand for power, and yet it's very, very difficult to get anything approved in terms of investment. There's an enormous amount of money, philanthropic money and development bank money, looking to go to Africa, but up till now, everything has been simply too complicated. And I think the instruments that have been chosen have been pretty complex. A lot of them have been around things like creating sovereign guarantees for companies around, for countries around specific investments in the power sector, and it gives you a kind of bit by bit kind of approach. I think something much more radical is required. A lot of these countries will require just a huge guarantee behind power production, behind offtake, in order to kickstart their power markets. We can't just wait for years and years of spontaneous market growth and power sector reform. I mean, this needs to happen now. And I think it can be done. You literally need to guarantee people's ability to install and sell and buy power. And then on manufacturing, I can't see a situation where somehow the West plus China builds solar panels and builds wind turbines and then sells them to the developing world, because what's the incentive for countries to transition? Where are the jobs? Where are the skills? How is the talent being given outlook? And we've really, I think, as an industry, changed the way we look at it. And I think we should go to countries with a proposition that's not just about we'll sell you some clean energy kit, but that we will transfer knowledge, we'll transfer skills, we'll build industrialization locally. We'll have other ways of doing offtake as well. So I think things like hydrogen and ammonia and how they fit into countries' economies as well give a lot of scope for local industrialization as well.
Well, on that call to action, I hope you'll join me in thanking Ben and Cecilia.
Please welcome to the stage Hanneke Farber, president of the Nutrition Business Group at Unilever, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Agnieszka de Souza.
Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning, Hanneke.
Good morning.
I'm really thrilled to meet you finally in person. We actually had a few conversations during the pandemic over Zoom, and when we talked about the future of food, and I remember your reflections on how the pandemic was changing consumer attitudes. I remember at the time you pointed out that consumers were more concerned about how food impacts their health. They were more interested in where their food comes from, and they were much more aware about sustainability. And here we are, we're in the midst of a cost of living crisis, food inflation is on people's minds, and I just wonder, how is that reshaping attitudes to sustainability and sustainable food productions when it comes to consumers and when it comes to companies like yourselves?
Yeah, great question, because clearly consumers, what's top of mind for them is the cost of living. But in terms of striving for a sustainable food system, nothing has changed for us at Unilever. And you might wonder, okay, isn't that expensive, or is that really good for consumers? Is that really good for shareholders? We believe it's actually critical for both that we continue to drive food that is healthier for people and healthier for the planet. And it's really for three reasons. The first one is food security, and I'll talk about that for a moment. Second one is there's actually savings. If you reduce food waste, for example, that's actually a saving that can go back into more affordable products. And the third reason is consumers still want it. I mean, I travel for my job all around the world. I spend time with consumers, and I've yet to meet a mother who says, well, I'd really like to feed my children food that's unhealthy. It just doesn't happen. So those trends are still there. I do want to touch on food security and why it's so intricately linked to sustainability. If any of you were on vacation in France last year or you live in France, you'll have noticed that there was no mustard last summer. We're the biggest seller of mustard in France with the Amora and My brands. And what had happened last year is that we sourced from Canada and from France. There were droughts in Canada and floods in France, and the harvests failed in both places because of climate change. And our backup last spring was the Ukraine. We know how that ended up. There was literally no mustard. We had about 20% of the mustard seeds that we would have in a usual year. And that's because of climate change. Now, the world can probably live without mustard, but this year what we're seeing is the tomato crop in Spain will be down significantly again after being down 40% last year because of droughts. The wheat crop around the world will be the worst in centuries. So we have to change the way we farm. We have to farm more sustainably to mitigate the effects of climate change. And so sustainable farming is certainly one of our, regenerative farming is one of our focus areas that we'll continue to drive.
Mm-hmm. And just in terms of regenerative farming, I know this is one of those concepts that can mean so many different things to so many different people. The definitions are rather fluid. So I was interested to know, what does regenerative agriculture mean for Unilever? What sort of initiatives you're pursuing? And if you could just talk us through, I do believe we've got some images as well you brought with us.
Well, I think, yeah, that was me in a field in Iowa, which is one of our biggest programs. But yeah, the first question people always have is, what is it? So what is it? It's practices that our grandparents used to use on their farms. So this is not rocket science. It's things like crop rotation. It's cover cropping, keeping your soils covered. It's no-till or low-till farming, so not plowing too much. It's biodiversity strips, so actually having hedges and trees around your farm. So that's not rocket science. What is rocket science is actually measuring the impacts of that versus the industrial farming that we mostly do today. And that's what we're focused on. Because what we believe and what we're seeing in our programs where we do regenerative farming, that it can reduce emissions, that it reduces the use of water, that it improves soil health, which is so critical, that it improves biodiversity, and really importantly, that it can improve farmer incomes, which of course is critical if this is to be a sustainable way of farming. So it's the outcome-based approach. I'm less worried about the exact practices. They also differ from crop to crop. Regenerative farming in tomatoes is different from regenerative farming in soy or corn. But it's about the outcomes.
And just how do you measure those outcomes? Are there any certification bodies or any databases that can be used? Yeah. How does it work in practice?
Yeah, great question. So, so we have a bunch of scaled programs underway where measurement is a key part of it. So I'll give you one example. I think that was the one there I was in the field in Iowa. So we have about 50,000 hectares in Iowa soy where we're farming regeneratively, and we have been doing it now for 4 years. So this is not a new program, and it's huge, obviously, at 50,000 hectares. What we're doing there is cover cropping, no-till, and a few other smaller things. And what we're measuring is soil health, is carbon matter in the soil, and water use. And what we're seeing is really, really positive outcomes. But it takes a while. And that's something that is, not always welcomed by us, fast-moving consumer goods people. We want to see results in 3 months. Well, farming, it takes a few harvests, which means it takes a few years to see the results from changing your practices. But we have to do this. We have some tools that we've developed, a cool farm tool, that's actually its name, and a field print calculator that help the farmers measure what's going on. And we're working with the WBCSD to see, can we also start sharing data, because some of our competitors laudably are also starting to really make progress in regen ag.
And you mentioned that these techniques are not rocket science. They have been with us for millennia, really.
Yeah.
And what is preventing farmers from actually adopting them? Why did we lose them? At what point? And how do you incentivize farmers to actually switch back to them?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. You know, what happened is over the last 30 years, we've really focused, you know, and I say we, the entire system, has focused on farmers just focusing on productivity and not so much on soil health and things that are more sustainable. Farmers know what's good for their soil. In many cases, it's their own soil that they want to preserve for their children. So they know what to do. But a transition costs money to go back to these practices. So really, I would say two key barriers. One is money, one is knowledge, and seeing that it's working for others. So what are we doing if I go back to Iowa to the same example? In terms of knowledge and convincing them to actually do it, we're working with a fantastic organization called the Practical Farmers of Iowa. Never knew they existed, but they're a big organization of farmers, and it's farmers showing farmers that when you go back to these practices, that is actually good for your yields, for your input costs, and for your soil. So those types of collaborations are really important. And I've got many more examples of where we work with co-ops or other farmer organizations to get the movement going. And then the second thing is financial support for the transition. It takes 3 to 5 years, and farmers do need financial support for that transition. So we have a €1 billion climate and nature fund at Unilever, and we're tapping into that to support farmers.
And just in terms of consumers as well, because how do you envisage communicating with consumers that, let's say, you know, a jar of Hellmann's is made from ingredients that come from such farms? Like, where are we in terms of labeling, or, you know, would you like to communicate that sort of message, or do you have grand plans for actually covering all your ingredients to originate from such farms?
Yeah, so our plan is for this year, we will have more than 40 programs ranging from soybeans in Iowa to tomatoes in Spain to rice in Italy and Arkansas to tomatoes in India to cover 250,000 hectares this year. And by 2025, we will have 650,000 hectares, which is about half of our footprint of land we use at Unilever. So this is not small stuff. The time for pilots, guys, is really over. We have to do this at scale. And by 2025, we'll have about 100 crop country programs up and running. Your question is a great one. You know, how do we tell the consumer? I have to say we're still learning. Today on Hellmann's in the US, which is a huge business, is $1 billion business, we do mention it in our marketing materials. Consumers are still a bit like, sounds good, but you know, does it really create preference yet? Not yet. You know, we see other things that really create preference, and they're more in the cost of living space. So if I look at right now, Coleman's in the UK is running a campaign. I think it's called Tasty Dosh for less nosh. I can't pronounce these things correctly here, but that's working pretty well. It's straight on cost of living. On Knorr in the United States, we have a fantastic collaboration with Cardi B. She's never behaved as well as in this Knorr commercial. But that's also on the cost of a meal with Knorr versus fast food, which is a really favorable comparison. So that's what's top of mind for the consumer right now is her cost of living. So that's what's working more so than trying to market regenerative agriculture. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it. And we are absolutely clear that we're doing it, and we're doing it at scale.
And just in terms of regenerative agriculture, how does that fit in your broader sustainability plan? And you know, you did talk about sourcing, but I was curious to know whether, you know, how important it is to your net zero strategy.
Yeah, no, great question. So at Unilever, we have a commitment to be net zero by 2039, so 11 years ahead of the Paris agreements, which is a little scary. And that means by 2030, we have to be down 40%. In food, how do you do that? We are focused this decade on reductions, not offsets. We have to reduce emissions. And in food, we do that in a number of ways. The first big building block is regenerative agriculture, because again, the programs we have in the field right now do show significant reduction in emission from changing the way we farm. So that's the first one. Second one is less plastic, which of course is a fossil fuel. We have a lot of plastic packaging. We have to reduce and we have to recycle and make our packs made from recycled plastic. So we're at about 21% now of all our plastic packages that are made from recycled plastic. That has to go up probably to 100% for us to meet our goals. And then the last thing I'll mention is what we call eco-design, which is mainly plant-based design. So replacing animal ingredients by plant-based ingredients, that's a big part of our footprint as well. So you can think of dairy-free ice cream. A vegan Magnum is lovely. I recommend you try it. Vegan Hellmann's, the vegetarian butcher in plant-based meat, and various other products in our big range where we're replacing animal by non-animal ingredients.
So on that last point, alternative proteins, plant-based diets, I mean, cutting back on meat and animal products has been singled out as one of the most impactful climate solutions when tackling food's environmental footprint. And we did see, especially during the pandemic, we had a huge exuberance over those products, and it somewhat had fizzled out. The sales are not there in general terms. And there's a bit of struggle in terms of incentivizing consumers to actually come back and buy them again, right? So I was curious to know what are the prospects for this category? Do you think it has a future? And if so, what improvements need to be made in order to,
Yeah, great question. So the answer is absolutely. There's a bright future for meat and dairy replacements, if only because consumers still want it. In the UK, 1 out of 5 households has a vegan or a vegetarian in it today. In Europe, 60% of people say they would like to eat less meat. So that macro consumer trend is absolutely still there. Our business is in really good shape. We've reported, we had a goal of €1 billion in plant-based meat and dairy replacements. We set that for 2025. We hit 1.2 billion last year. So we're growing fast. We continue to grow fast across meat and dairy alternatives. And I think what's key to your question, how do we convince more consumers to replace some of their animal-based consumption for non-animal-based consumption, is taste. You're just not going to eat it if it tastes horribly. So I'm really proud. I dare you to taste the difference between Hellmann's and vegan Hellmann's. You really cannot taste it. And also the vegetarian butcher, which is harder, this fake meat. It's delicious stuff. We just came out with a new bacon. Oh my God, it's to die for. So taste is key. And then of course, clean label and the health profile of those products is also really important. So again, we've worked hard. All the vegetarian butcher products are now Nutri-Score A or B, so they're definitely in the healthy category. And that combination is working. So we're bullish on it. And again, we're in that space for the long term, if only because it's critical to net zero as well.
Meg, do we have any questions from the audience?
Yeah, we have a couple. First question, do you see a difference in sustainable farming practices in established countries versus developed countries?
Yeah. Yes and no. No, because we need practices that are better for soil health, emit less, reduce water everywhere. But the difference that we see if I compare, for example, we have a regenerative agriculture program on tomatoes in Spain and one in India with 25,000 farmers. So it's a big scaled program. And in Spain, also a large program with Agras, who is one of our suppliers. The practices and the benefits are similar. So in Spain, for example, we're seeing more than 30% emission reduction and a significant water reduction, which is so critical in an area of drought. We see similar impacts in India. However, when it comes to farmer incomes, it's very interesting because the farmers in Europe already have pretty high yields. The benefit in farmer incomes in Europe is actually from lower input cost, fertilizers and pesticides. So that's where the income benefit is in Europe. In India, where the yields were lower to start with, the farmer benefit is in higher yields. So that is a little different, but in both cases, there is a farmer benefit. And of course, the biggest benefit, honestly, if I look at Spain last year, the overall tomato crop in Spain was down 40% because of drought. Our tomatoes at Agras, where we'd been doing Regen Ag for 2 years at that point, we were able to keep our yields the same. And that is a huge benefit. I wouldn't have any tomato soup if it wasn't for that program.
What are the emissions of a regenerative agriculture approach versus traditional? Is it still net zero at scale?
Absolutely. That's the end goal.
Yeah.
And we have to do this. So I say the time for pilots is over. In the food industry, changing the way we farm is absolutely critical. And actually, there was an article in the FT this morning, again, on the UK struggling to get to its net zero goal, which is not different from any other country, honestly, but this one focused on the UK. And some good progress in electric vehicles, for example, but basically no progress in food and agriculture, which is such a huge part of the emissions footprint. So we have to move faster in food and ag.
Last one. So given the impact of inflation on food costs right now, do you find that consumers are hesitant to want to pay for the green premium for more sustainable products currently?
They've always been hesitant to pay a green premium, so that hasn't really changed. Maybe they're even more hesitant today, but I tell my people at work, we have to do this. So assume we are going to do this. We are investing in regenerative agriculture. We are investing in recycled plastic. We are investing in innovation in alternative proteins, because we have committed that we'll get to net zero by 2039. And then we need to find the savings in our business to offset that, and we are.
Great. Well, Hanneke, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks for having me.
Please welcome to the stage Paul Polman, business leader, campaigner, and co-author of Net Positive, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Malika Kapoor.
Paul, welcome.
Good morning.
I really enjoyed reading your book, Net Positive. For those of you who haven't had a chance to read it, this is a plug. It's a really great business book. I was struck by the title of your book, Net Positive. As you've heard this morning, we've been talking about net zero. And I wonder, are we really at a point where the conversation can shift from net zero to net positive?
Well, thanks for asking and thanks for having me here, but I don't think we have a choice, to be honest. The reason why we use net positive versus net zero is that we've really, for us, the definition of what a company needs to do goes well beyond the energy transition. We're talking about undermining of democracy, we're talking about human rights, we're talking about restoring our biodiversity. So our concept of net positive is a broader concept. We ask ourselves a very simple question: how companies can profit from solving the world's problems, not creating them. And as we have seen, it's well beyond climate alone. The second thing is we've overshot the planetary boundaries, really well beyond what we think. In fact, Johan Rockström at the Resilience Institute is looking at 9 planetary boundaries. 6 of them we've already exceeded. So we have to restore our biodiversity. We have to bring our oceans back. The world's capacity to absorb, for example, climate change is running out. And the issues are significantly higher than we think, and it takes us a longer time to address. So the only way that companies can survive in the future is actually with a restorative, reparative, regenerative mindset. And you start to see that happen. Microsoft and Ørsted, Danish energy company, looking at carbon capture storage or taking carbon out of the air going back to when the company started. Walmart making big commitments like Unilever on regenerative agriculture. Google going water positive, etc. And the third thing, which is important for us, why we call it net positive, is that we also think that companies need to have an active participation in driving these broader systems changes. I saw one of your polls looking there in the other room, but we were waiting about the complexities of European legislation. Might be true, might not be true. It depends on what side of the mirror you're sitting. But at the end of the day, it does call out the need for companies to be actively involved in that policy setting, to be sure that we get the right policies. And often the right policies is actually less policies, not more. But it does require this active participation, and we just see too few companies doing that.
Like you said, it goes beyond climate change, right? What else can a company do to become net positive?
Well, for us, net positive has 5 characteristics, if I may say. So the first one is to take responsibility of your total impact in the world. It starts really there. There are very few companies, actually, even today, that take commitments for Scope 3. Many companies in many industries think they can outsource their value chain and also outsource their responsibility. It just doesn't work anymore. It is taking care of all of your stakeholders, taking a longer-term view on the business, not the myopic short-term view. Seeing shareholder return, which is important, but seeing that as a result of what you do, not as a myopic objective. And then last but not least, be involved in these broader systems changes. Now, how do we implement a European biodiversity directive, a farm-to-fork strategy, a sustainable reporting directive that makes sense? Be active part of these discussions as we change the way we do business.
When you were CEO of Unilever back in 2009, you started pushing sustainability and this idea of just doing good business very early on, really before it became sort of a must-have on the corporate agenda. And you launched the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, which basically pushed social and environmental progress along with economic growth. If you had to launch a sustainable living plan today, what would it look like and how might it be different from the plan you launched back then?
Well, there will be a lot of differences because the world has moved on. But when we started in 2009, it was not just a conviction. You know, the science was there. We had a lot of evidence that we were destroying the planet, that our linear extractive production and consumption methods were running out of time. And these issues have only piled up in the last 10, 15 years. So we might have been a little bit ahead of the trend in the sense of not having the data to prove that it actually is a good business, which we do have now. Being a little bit progressive in some of the commitments we made based on sound science. By the way, we never moved away from that. But, you know, few companies at that time were ready. The financial market wasn't, frankly, as ready as it should have been. So it was a struggle to get it higher on the agenda to some extent. But it was all an effort to move from responsible business to resilient business. I think the next step that really companies have to look at is what we talked about, move to regenerative business. Not just focusing on output and growth, but on impact. You know, it's basically, you have to think about, we've done very well with the fossil fuel economy and has given us a lot of wealth, at least for a certain part of the world's population, not all, but it's given us a lot of wealth. And then from the fossil fuel economy, it became the data economy. We invented the internet and all the other things, and an enormous amount of wealth creation again that you've seen. Even this year, all the stock market increases are basically in the top 5 technology companies. And I think now we're moving from a fossil to a technology to a biodiversity economy. How can we live in harmony with planet Earth? Planet Earth will always be there, but we're seriously challenging our own existence. We've lost 70% of the world's species in the last 5 decades. Some people call it the 6th greatest extinction. We're cutting forests as if we don't care. As long as a dead tree is valued more than a tree that's alive, we frankly are in trouble. So we need to move to a thinking holistically and living in harmony with nature. In fact, we are nature. The word human and humus that Hanneke just talked about, the ground has its same derivative. And if we don't understand that, we're actually working very hard on our own demise. So we have to think about that in that regenerative sense.
You've consistently talked about serving multiple stakeholders, and that includes people, your own employees at a company. And recently, you've been quite active in talking about the younger generation, the workforce. We've seen a generational change in people's expectations from companies that they work at. We've been through a period of quiet quitting, and now we are seeing what you've described as conscious quitting. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we're actually looking now, the way I always describe it, I've moved from formal or board authority when I was the CEO of Unilever for a decade to probably more moral authority. I don't have the money, the big organization behind me and all the other things. And we're continuously looking at tipping points to move things forward faster. How can we drive CEOs to a higher level of ambition, a higher level of action? Because the direction is clear. We don't have to debate it anymore. What we need to do is well understood by most people, but the speed and the scale with which we're doing it is frankly missing. And one of these surprising tipping points that companies ought to be very sensitive to is your own employees. It would have been unheard of 5 or 10 years ago that your own employees would walk out of your company. And now it's a weekly occurrence somewhere in the world that people actually walk out because they don't see the company's commitments being put into action. They don't believe the CEOs are genuine. They don't think that companies go far enough versus what they really should be doing. And employees increasingly, I always say in every company, there's a Greta Thunberg now, employees increasingly speak up, organize themselves and take. So what we really see amongst the millennials, the Gen Zs and so forth, a significant increase in them selecting companies based on their values, based on the commitments these companies make. They want to be part of something bigger than just earning money. They want to work for companies that actually make this a better world. And 30% actually have left companies because of that, because they didn't see words matching actions, and 45% is considering that. And these numbers are significantly higher if you go to these younger age groups that we're talking about. So that's why we call it conscious quitting. And it was the second most talked discussion on LinkedIn for a long time, so it hit a lot of strings, and we got a lot of people to say, yeah, that's exactly what I'm doing or considering, and companies ought to be careful about that. Like in the UK now, if you look in London, 75% of CEOs say they can't get the talent they want. Well, the first thing to start is to keep the talent you have, and that's...
Yeah, I was struck because when you did post this on LinkedIn, as we talked about earlier, it really resonated.
Incredible. In Unilever, when we moved to this Unilever Sustainable Living Plan that you referred to, which is really decoupling our growth from environmental impact,
yes,
increasing our overall social impact, 53 overarching targets, 50 big targets. Hanneke talked about some of them. What we were surprised about was that we became the third most looked up company in LinkedIn after Google and Apple. We're not a brand name in a sense, So it was quite surprising to us, and we got over 2 million people applying. We didn't have any problem attracting talent, in a sense. So there's something out there that is happening to these younger generations that would be better take notice of.
I also want to talk about consumers. Being at Unilever, you provided people around the world with the everyday essential items that they need, which gives you a really special and unique window into what customers are thinking and what they're prioritizing. How has customer expectation from corporates changed over the last, say, 10 years?
Yeah, so I never liked the word consumer. Even when I went into Unilever, big revolution, the boss doesn't like consumers, and this is all we're doing. But, you don't consume a car, you use a car. You don't consume a house, right. You use a house. You don't consume a barbecue in the summer, you use a barbecue. So if we start thinking about usage, then you also get very quickly to circularity, you get to optimization of use of materials and all that. So some things you do consume, I understand that. But even then you need to be very responsible to ensure that consumers, using your word, citizens as I call them, can continue to do that. So it's very important. Most companies are inside-out companies. They're full of themselves, they have a lot of money, and they advertise, and if it doesn't work, they advertise a little bit more, but basically they stuff it down your throat. And that has resulted in this, irresponsible consumption pattern. You can't blame the consumers for that. But if you treat them like citizens, you all of a sudden start to understand their problems. That's why many of our brands, Domestos, a toilet bowl cleaner, we had to attack the issues of open defecation. Lifebuoy from India, we had to attack the issues of infectious diseases. 5 million children losing their lives before the age of 5. So we became problem solvers of big societal issues. And that expanded these brands, that made these brands grow faster. And that's really the essence of putting purpose at the core of the business. So what we now see with younger people, that is far more attractive to them. As I said before, they want to be part of solving some of these solutions. And they actually are increasingly making their brand choices based on their values. You know, basic performance for many of these brands has become pretty close. So they're starting to select these brands on a little bit more than just the technical or you know, the ingredient sides of it.
When I was reading your book, the one thing I was struck by is how often you touched upon the word, how often you use the word courage. And very often you talk about how it's really important for leadership, for business leaders to do the right thing. What's the most courageous decision you've taken as a business leader?
Well, I don't like to talk about myself too much, but courage comes from the French word cor, or the Latin derivative of cor, or the French word cœur. So it's speaking from the heart. So it's being true to yourself. And that's missing in a lot of cases right now, where companies make commitments that are minimal, they can get away with, versus what science will tell you, where they agree that some issues need to be addressed, but they delegate it to others. It doesn't become their problem. Where partnerships are not the genuine ones to drive the broader systems changes. So courage is actually acting in the face of fear versus flighting in the face of fear, if you want to, and how to deal with that. And that comes from a stronger sense of inner core or purpose. There's no question about it. So I don't know. I actually think that most of the things we did was common sense because the world needed it. Science was requiring it. I think it takes more courage to deny that. It might sound horrible, and that's not how we use the interpretation of the word courage. But to deliberately do the wrong things versus what society needs. To deliberately put things in your own interest when you know it's not in the interest of the common good. To say one thing and do another thing, I think to some extent takes more courage. So I don't like to say what we did was courage. We abolished quarterly reporting, we abolished guidance, that was a big thing in those days. Yeah. But it was needed to create a space for people to operate in the longer term. And it served as well, 300% shareholder return over 10 years, outgrowing our competitors' top and bottom line. Sure, you need to run the business with discipline, but these things you can do much better if you take a little bit of a longer horizon. And frankly, the financial market, at least a big part of the financial market, would actually support that. So I don't know if that is courage or not. I tend to look at courage much more in individuals that I see. You know, we run one of our biggest foundations, we run as 25,000 blind or deaf-blind children in school in Africa in 8 countries. And if I see, I was just coming back from Kenya, and I see the people working with these kids at a pittance of a salary, putting their lives ahead of, the lives of these kids ahead of their own. That's what I call courage and leadership. The doctors that go to Ebola and COVID when they don't even have a medicine yet, putting their own lives at risk. That's what I call courage. You know, we post a question on LinkedIn.
I was just going to say, yes.
Yeah, which is amazing again how reactions come out there, you know.
Yes.
But someone posted this morning like one of their bosses sold their house, his own private house, because he didn't want to take a loan. He didn't want to put the company in debt. And he used the money of his private house to be sure that he could keep paying his employees. And had to buy back a house 3 years later when house prices had doubled. But the guy said, if I do it today, I'd do it again. We had an employee in Unilever that gave up one of the organs to an intern who came in, who wasn't even part of the company, but needed an organ transplant and
that
sacrificed
one really
their own.
struck me.
So that's, to me, that is the level of courage. What we do as CEOs, you know, most of that stuff, we like to blow it up, but it doesn't really fall under that heading. And courage is truly when you put yourself to the service of others, knowing that by doing so, you're better off yourselves as well. And that takes a lot before you get to that point.
And all of you can weigh in on this conversation as well. You can just go to LinkedIn, and Paul has asked, you know, what's
put your ideas on there.
Yeah, put your ideas on there. Paul might respond. You know, one thing that keeps coming up is we hear about companies doing amazing work. We hear about their net zero targets. We hear about them doing good work in the field through their foundations. How do you decipher what is noise and what's actually being done?
It's becoming easier. Obviously, I have the advantage of speaking with a lot of CEOs. There's another week that goes by that I don't speak to 20 or 30 CEOs or work with industry collectives, understand what's happening. I always look people in the eye, and you can see if they tell the truth or not. If you see 5 people from the communications department around them, a piece of paper that they read from, you have a high chance that you deal with a lot of baloney. So these things you can pick up. AI, obviously, is a very good tool to see as well, but nothing beats real action, explaining what people do, not what they say. Stephen Covey in his book 7 Habits said it very well when he said, you cannot talk yourself out of things you have behaved yourself into. So I don't get too excited by big commitments. I get really excited by things that are happening. And here is the reality, if we like it or not. We have a carbon budget of about 500 gigatons left. That led to the carbon law, like Moore's law, 50% reduction every decade to stay within the 1.5 degrees by 2050. The reality is we are now finding out that the Earth's capacity to compensate for our lack of moving is less than we thought, that we're getting closer to negative tipping points. And it turns out, as will soon be published, that our carbon budget is more like 250 gigatons, which means actually that in the next 5-6 years, we'll be hitting the 1.5 degrees. If you think it's serious now, which it is, it will get significantly more serious. The carbon emissions this decade are going up 14%, when it should go down 45%.
Oh my God, the numbers are so
we're
bright.
well off our track. The COP28 is not done, and we can talk that later. So we're well off track. So companies that make commitments by 2050 is kicking the can down the road. Companies that only make commitments by 2050 and not have anything by 2030 is outright irresponsible. And there are many companies that have made science-based target commitments, 4,000 companies, $38 trillion of market cap. So there are things happening. But are we putting it at the speed that is needed? Are we fully internalizing these challenges? I think we still have some way to go.
I know we have questions from the audience. I want to go to Meg right away.
How can governments support this transition more effectively?
Well, so what we have seen, fortunately, if you take let's take the last decade, to not get too emotional on the discussions of the last 6 months, but we've seen environmental legislation probably more than doubling. And there are some incredible pieces of regulation, if you want to call it, of frameworks. The IRA, Infrastructure or CHIP Act in the US is dramatically changing the environment there. From a far behind to a catch-up mode, I would say, not a leadership thing. The European taxonomy or corporate sustainability directives are good pieces of legislation. Europe increasingly becoming the standard setter for the world. The border adjustments for carbon would be another example, or the deforestation directives influences other parts of the world. But we see the same happening everywhere. In fact, contrary to what people think, if you take emerging markets like Chile or Morocco or Tunisia or China, if you want to call it that, they're actually significantly farther ahead on the conversion to green energy than the US is, even today. So we see this acceleration happening. What governments can do more, if you talk just about climate change, is really putting their commitments into action. What we talk about CEOs, long on words and short on action, I think that is also a disease that has crept into governments, where most of them cannot look beyond their nose or the next election, which seems to be every 2 or 3 weeks, where attention seems to be drawn down to the crisis for here and now versus the longer term thing. So how to really get them to understand that nature-based solutions are important is still a struggle. As Hanneke was talking about, how to get to sustainable agriculture, food and land use systems, 30% of the problem, also 30% of the solution, a very fast response, low investment, high returns, but yet it's still a struggle to get it on the agenda. And she gave some examples here from the UK, which I totally subscribe to. So how do you keep that on the political agenda? How do you give politicians more courage is something that business needs to take more responsibility of. I've always said that we've benefited for a long period of time from governance running well, democracies functioning, etc. Now we have a difficult period. There's no question. Multilateral institutions not quite designed for what they need to deliver on today, etc. Populism, nationalism coming into national politics, exactly because we're not addressing these issues. But that is the moment for business to step up and de-risk that political process. And yet too few businesses do that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Paul. We could have carried on, but I know we're out of time. But thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you.
we'll go out this way.
Please welcome to the stage Rayed Albasit, Group Chief Environment and Sustainability Officer at Red Sea Global, Daniel Palm, Head of Private Equity and Financial Institutions of Sustainability Business at Schneider Electric, Ben Taylor, Global Strategy and Markets Leader, Climate Change and Sustainability Services at EY, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Lauren Keel.
Good morning, everyone. Good to see you. Very excited to be with you for our conversation today around the power of technology and data. And I want to start with a topic that I know all three of you deal with, and probably most of you in the audience deal with as well, which is around regulations and reporting and the challenges and intensity that that can take. So Ben, I want to start with you on this. When you're working with your clients on their disclosures and their reporting, how are you thinking about how you can use things like technology, generative AI, to help streamline some of that very data-intensive process?
That's a great question, Lauren. I mean, we've been waiting for this moment for probably 20 years in the corporate sustainability world, solidifying consistent requirements on companies. So the upside for the world is more transparency, and we're clearly seeing companies having to think about what we would call foundational sustainability work for the first time. So thinking about climate risk, thinking about greenhouse gas inventories, thinking about nature risk assessment, water, pollution, et cetera. It's very far-reaching, particularly in the EU. The danger, of course, is that distracts, the compliance effort distracts from the real work, if I can call it that, of delivering sustainable outcomes. And we're actually seeing some clients actually having to divert resources. But I think inherently, technology has got to play a big part in that. We don't want to end up in a few years of having huge manual industries. And in fact, I would argue we don't have time and we don't have the skills. So technology and data needs to be part of that. Whether it's data mapping tools right at the start, CSRD in Europe, there's over 100 disclosure requirements, over 1,000 data points companies need to get to. But generative AI is quite interesting as well. We're starting to look at that on the reporting side. And then from an assurance point of view, how we use AI to spot, all of the multiple complex correlations that would spot an issue. So I think our message to companies is don't wait to think about technology and data after you've figured out what you need to do. Bring technology and data right up front in that project.
And Rayed, how do you contextualize what you're sharing? Obviously, there's stuff that's required and mandatory. But there's a lot that's still voluntary as well. So as you're putting out this data, people don't always have the full picture, right? How do you think about how much you share, the way that you share, so that people really understand that full story?
Well, that's a very good point, and you need to have a two-way communication with your stakeholders and understand what level of information do they need and what do they need it for, so that you would enable their own decision-making as well. And this ranges from government to shareholders as well to locals within the area. It's been really very important for us from the beginning to understand when we communicate this and the information that we have, is one, understand what they need to know, but also understand that they need to know what is the starting point for any ambition, what is the starting point for us in terms of biodiversity, in terms of the challenges, in terms of the existing stresses on the environment, as well as the socioeconomic situation of when you start to develop for a giga project. But as you also need, in terms of transparency, to tell them where you're heading, and to tell them what is your level of ambition, how do you envision achieving that, and you need to demonstrate action on the ground. People need to see and understand that you're taking steps towards achieving that ambition. Where are you, and what are the challenges that you're dealing with? Without providing all of that to the people are much more knowledgeable than they used to be before. I mean the use of technical terms, for example. My 12-year-old son now understands much more about sustainability than I used to understand when I was 12 years old. So people understand these technical terms. People understand now the global challenges in terms of environment protection, regeneration, and sustainability. So I think we benefit from that in the way that when we communicate, we don't have to tell a lot, but we need to cover everything for them to understand the full context.
Daniel, I want to bring you in on this point that he just brought up around kind of the language and understanding in this space. When you're talking to a private equity client or financial service client, and you're talking about ESG, are people speaking the same language?
That is an interesting point you're actually raising over here, because ESG is a very broad topic, and ultimately it comes down to the fact that there's a myriad of different interpretations in there, there's a myriad of different understandings in there, and there's ultimately a myriad of different approaches down there. What does this ultimately translate into? This more like means that people out there, private equity firms, but also financial institutions, just like everybody out in the market, pursues what they more like think is best. But we need to be coming from a technological perspective. On the one hand, we need to have a common level playing field. We need to more like speak all the same language. We need to focus on the same aspects to more like drive this initiative, drive this ESG journey of all of ours going forward to the extent that it makes most sense to us. Now, bearing that in mind, there's a certain shift also in here, which perhaps even complicates it further. I think historically, ESG has been a little bit more on the risk management side. This is much more turning outwards focused, much more focused on perceiving ESG as an opportunity to have impact, an opportunity to create value going forward, and an opportunity to drive this ultimately. So all of that in mind, language ultimately is the common factor. It is important that we do have a level playing field where everybody has the same starting point and that we do talk about the same things.
And how do you think we get more of a common language? Is that a responsibility of governments, of firms, of ratings agencies? I mean, who is responsible for getting us to a more common language there?
I think there's different viewpoints you can ultimately take on this aspect. I think we as a society need to further define and clarify as to where we basically want to go. For the time being, everybody is trying and is out there with their very best effort, and I think that's perfectly fine. Over time, however, new technologies will emerge. Over time, we will have new ideas, new thought pathways, and so on. But bearing in mind what the ultimate goal is, net zero by 2050, for instance, there is certain pathways we can be pursuing from here onwards, and that in mind, certain ideas will emerge.
If I may add to that, I mean, one of the best advantages and the best achievements of international regulations in particular and international policymakers is establishing this common language. Because all of these terms, technical terms, are defined, the baseline is defined, and in terms of pathways, as you've described, these pathways are also defined. And so that creates a common language globally. And there is also a common language that needs to be established locally as well. And when you work when you are working with a particular community or on a particular geographical area, there is common language that you need to tap into to understand your situation, to understand where you're operating, what are you impacting. But also when you communicate to people as well in the language they already use and they already understand.
Ben, I want to go back to a point that you raised in the first question around cannibalization of efforts and kind of how do you keep regulation from being something that's taking away from actual value creation or actual sustainability progress? What are the best ways to do that?
Well, probably two bits to the answer. I think first of all is how companies can use data and tech was part of the first answer, but the technology market around sustainability is very fast moving, and there's a lot of players moving into it. There's a lot of venture capital money backing new data providers and aggregators, et cetera. We've invested significantly in our alliance relationships with strategic partners such as IBM, Microsoft, SAP, because every company has in some form those enterprise systems, and our first message is use what you have. I mean, a couple of simple examples. Our Scope 3 emissions related to travel is our biggest environmental impact, arguably, other than office footprint. So, driving behavior change was really important to us. We already had travel systems. We already had booking systems. But embedding a carbon calculator into the booking system to allow people to think about not just cost, but actually the carbon impact has driven down emissions quite significantly, so that behavior change. And then the other one, working with IBM around a system called Maximal, which is an asset management system. That's been around for decades to help companies think about safety and cost management around their asset base. We've worked with them to build a sustainability lens to it. So when you're making decisions about replacing equipment or maintenance around equipment, there's also a carbon impact. Carbon intensity has a direct relationship to cost and, guess what, to safety. So it's just thinking a bit differently and building in sustainability use cases. The second part, if I could just build that in, is also thinking about where you're going to get the skills from. Because if you take highly trained environmental scientists and engineers and get them doing spreadsheets and checklists for compliance, that's clearly the wrong answer. So we see a lot of companies coming to us now and asking us actually for managed service. How do we get data operations? How do we get business operations run as a seamless operation rather than distracting? And for us, that's quite a nice mission to help companies focus on what they should be doing, which is just that sustainability project.
All right, I want to bring you in on this point that Ben raised around kind of nudging and behavior change, right? You are dealing with a massive pool of stakeholders. If you think about all the people that you're working with on the ground, all the governments you're working with, entities you're working with, people, like you have to deal with a huge pool. So how are you thinking about using technology or using data to drive more understanding?
Well, it's really a big challenge, and it is, technology does come to the aid. Post-COVID, and where we exist now in Saudi, on the west coast of Saudi, on the Red Sea, post-COVID, people now, even the Bedouins and the camel carriers within our region have smartphones, and even if they are illiterate or cannot read Arabic or English, they have learned how to use a smartphone, they have learned how to access it and how to open a certain app. So we've capitalized on this, and we are launching very soon an app of our own just to communicate with the locals and have two-way communication with them. This enables us to collect a lot more data and a lot more information from the people, because they are our best asset to understand the situation, to understand the environment, and to understand that interaction and that engagement. How is the Giga project impacting their lives? What aspect of their lives are being impacted, and how do we manage any potential negative impacts, and how do we capitalize on any opportunities? All of that we cannot learn without having that level of communication. We are engaging with a lot of stakeholders from the government level, from the private sector, from partners as well, and with scientists and engineers. And I loved what you mentioned into that it's not the answer to give the scientists or the engineers the spreadsheets and the data to deliver on. Separation and a good governance and separation between the people who need to plan and the people who need to implement and the people who need to check. I think that separation is key, and then directing that communication between the stakeholders and the relevant internal stakeholder, I think is also key. The planning people need to understand how what is on the ground at the moment is impacting their lives. How are we impacting the environment at the moment? Deployment of all of the sensors, more than 2,700 sensors that are automatically collecting information from the environment around us. They need that information to guide their planning, but also the people on the ground implementing need also that information to guide, to adjust and tweak what they do to minimize any negative impacts, and also the opportunities on the strategic level. All of these opportunities are emerging from conversations with people, from conversations with partners.
I think that's a really interesting example that you give around the technology use of the app and how you're bringing in the community. Was that a difficult process to get there, or were they immediately ready to uptake on this? How did you go through that process of bringing the community in?
We want to use smartphones and apps, and people now have easy access to those to communicate with two main stakeholders. One is the locals within where the Giga project exists. This is because we want to continue. We have learned so much from them 4 or 5 years ago when we started the planning phase. We want to continue to learn from them on how do we coexist and how do we add and benefit. We want the ambition is to go beyond sustainability, and the ambition is to go into regenerative tourism. And in order for you to do that, you need to be guided by your stakeholders and the environment, and where are the opportunities that you can invest your resources so that you add to improving people's livelihood, to improving people's lives, and also improving the environment and enhancing the environment. All of that is only happening through that communication. But also on the other side, with tourists, future tourists that will be visiting our destination, communication is also key. The tourist needs to, for them to be part of the journey that we have started, for them to be part of the regenerative tourism model, they need to understand how are they interacting with that within their environment. The Red Sea project, for example, and the Amala project, both projects are in a pristine location of high conservation value. They are giga projects, they are not small projects. And tourists who will visit this area, they need to understand how are they being part of the story. And in order for them to really feel and understand and believe that, we need to share some information with them on a daily basis, and they need to have opportunities as well to contribute to that regeneration.
Daniel, I imagine you get pitched all the time by companies or new technologies, being brought to you. How do you decide where to put your time, your effort? How do you decide where to direct clients?
Look, I think from our perspective, the world has changed. As stupid and as common as it basically may sound. I think the world nowadays is much more complex than it used to be, and it does require integrated solutions. So bearing that in mind, that's ultimately our guiding framework over here. Like, where do we have white spots? Where do the clients need more of certain specific skill sets? There is no one singular ESG expert out there. There is no one singular party which can cover it all. So it's more about taking an integrator approach and looking into how can you plug into the right parties, who has value to add, who can solve very specific challenges, who does more fit into your clients, but also, of course, into your own network from a value perspective, from an outline perspective, from a scaling perspective, from a technological and innovation perspective. So there's a number of different elements. Of course, we also need to bear in mind that is it financeable, is it feasible for the client over here? Because the best solution is not going to solve any issue if it's not for the market and not to be financed.
Ben, I want to ask you the same question. If a technology comes across your desk or you hear about a new startup in the sustainability tech space, what are you looking for? What catches your eye?
Yeah, we do get approached a lot, and it's a very exciting market, but it's a very confusing market, I would say. So we've followed a similar approach. I think the one Daniel described. We've got very clear integrated solutions that we are focused on helping clients. So decarbonization, sustainable supply chain, sustainable consumer innovation, et cetera. So we've got a blueprint that we're fitting within. We know where we're interested to open up. I'd say the criteria, is something around clearly distinctive capability, but also I think in this space of sustainability, the thing that turns us off most is when someone is trying to be really smart with a proprietary method, for example, in greenhouse gas baselining, and taking a deviation from standards that are out there. I think this is uniquely a space where we need to work together and collaborate, and we need to share and open source as much as possible. We need to back big initiatives like Science-Based Targets Initiative, or get behind the ISSB, CSRD. The language point is well made. I think there's a lot of definition and criteria that are actually becoming quite helpful, but already we're talking to clients in the details, and they're like, yeah, but what does that really mean in practice? And I think this is where we've got to not come up with our own definitions, but actually work with the standard setters and work with the open initiatives to create commonality. So from a startup perspective, for us, it's those that are using, taking what they can from the open market, finding smart ways of accelerating client journeys, using emerging technology in a smart way, particularly AI is obviously hot right now, super hot, and plugging into a specific client need that's really well defined.
We've talked a decent amount about challenges, so I want us to all focus on something really positive. So I'm going to go to each of you. I want you to give me an example of either a technology that you are using or your clients have using, something that you feel like has really benefited your sustainability efforts. So give us a positive example of where you're seeing this actually really come to life. Right, I'll start with you.
Well, we are on the lookout for technologies to be adopted in our destinations, and we are taking risks. We are taking bold moves into adopting these technologies, even the ones that need piloting and need testing. But we have so much technologies now and available scanning technologies. For example, drone scanning that is driven by AI. Underwater for scanning our corals, for example. So we don't need to wait for years, 5 years or 10 years to understand how are we interacting with the corals, or what we are our methods for enhancing the corals, what are the real benefits for that? We are now measuring corals at the level of millimeter in terms of growth. That tells us within the span of 1 year how effective the methods and the applications that we're applying to the coral is really enhancing them or implementing them. We can very quickly understand what is the performance and what is the real efficiency of the methods that we're deploying, so that we can change it, adopt it, tweak it to achieve better results moving forward. We don't have to wait decades now.
That's very cool. Is that possible? So you see something in a year and you're like, okay, this isn't working, like about face, let's do something different.
Even less than a year. I mean, in order for us to coexist with the pristine environment, we had to up the ante on the monitoring. The monitoring is not your standard monitoring for any developer within the marine environment. We exist in an area that houses one of the most beautiful coral reefs in the world. And we understand that this is a huge responsibility on our shoulders. So the monitoring equipment that we deploy is at a scale that has never been seen before. We even now went beyond the monitoring into feeding that information into the drones to understand not only are we in compliance or not in terms of what are the levels of pollution, for example. No, we're trying to understand how are we enhancing the environment on the coral, moving coral, adding more sunlight, the floating nurseries that we've developed on site. These are floating nurseries, an innovative approach into growing coral. We adjust the height, the depth actually of the floating nursery. We adjust the oxygen levels. We adjust all of the nutrients level. We adjust the sunlight reaching the coral. All of these tweaks helps us to understand what is the optimum conditions for our investment to achieve the best results.
That's really exciting. Great examples. Daniel, over to you. Give us some positive examples.
I mean, look, it's Schneider Electric. And Schneider Electric is a huge company with almost 300,000 employees with this huge and deep engineering expertise on the one hand, but also the advisory bit on the other hand. I don't even know where to start with solutions over here. We can talk about physical solutions from smart metering for real estate, perhaps a little bit more scope 1 focused, where we very much can help clients to become more efficient, to electrify ultimately on their journey. But it can also be scope 2 solutions, where we can support you with novel solutions in terms of how can you get PPAs enacted, like we do have a huge network with utility companies, for instance. We have also our solutions on the supply chain side, for instance, which is we have undergone the entire exercise ourselves. And it's a monumental task in all fairness. It's still ongoing and it will be ongoing like it is for the most of the world ongoing at this point in time. So there's a lot of different ways, from data solutions, electrification solutions, efficiency solutions, I want to point out over here, and which are very important.
Fantastic. Ben,
yeah.
Same question to you.
Well, I love the fact that I hear regenerative business mentioned a lot, and this is clearly the goal, to move to regenerative, not just incremental kind of improvements. We need to move fast. And I love Rad's example of using tech, 2,700 sensors. Because a lot of the technology and a lot of what companies struggle with is a little bit is understanding the context in which they operate, particularly if they've got remote locations. What is their footprint in largest possible sense? So let me give you an example. And I'm not sure how many people would know that EY is in the space game, but we've invested in space technology, working with some of the agencies to help companies map their operations. So what better way of looking at their planetary impact than looking at the planet and zooming in? So for example, working with some mining companies in Australia, where it's not just about environmental impact, water scarcity, vegetation management, but it's also about the relationship between climate, nature, and human rights. So some of the nature projects for the mining companies are, buying up land with indigenous stakeholders. And it's really, really important. You've seen some of the cases where that's gone wrong, that they understand literally the physical space in which they're operating, and understanding the creeping and accelerating impact of climate change, what they can do on nature, and then the impact on indigenous villages. The worst possible cases are where, a company inadvertently has a nature project which is run by a third party and then impacts on indigenous stakeholders because they're, for example, pushed out of land that is then being used for regeneration. So that's just one example. You'd never think of it like space tech, but actually it's a very practical way of thinking about context for companies.
Daniel, how do you think about the need for collaboration, working across industry, potentially working with competitors, the value of data and information sharing? How do you balance that with what's good for your business?
Yeah. Look, at the end of the day, it's relatively simple. What's good for our clients is good for the business, is good for everybody in that respect. We do partner with a lot of different companies. It more like goes back to the white space approach, like how can we function as an integrator, whom can we bring in to solve very specific challenges so that we do take the complexity for our clients out of the game, but instead ultimately operate as a one-stop shop solution provider. It's almost like an EPC project nowadays. With all these different huge monumental challenges ahead, how can we help you? Who needs to be coming in? And how do we fill the white spots?
Right, similar question to you. How do you think about how you differentiate yourselves from others? You know, while you want to share data, obviously it's key to your success, key to the communities. How do you decide what you share? How do you decide where you share the best practices, but also say these are the things that are going to make us special and different?
Maybe one of the things on the global level, one of the things that are unique maybe in Saudi at the moment is that it's just becoming a hub, and we're working with everybody. We're working with Ernst & Young, we're working with many leading organizations, we're working with scientists, we're partnering with them, and we're becoming a catalyst and enabling entrepreneurs to test their technologies and apply them to where we exist. In terms of sharing information, I think one of the unique situations that we're in is the government's approach into bottom-up regulations, into finding out the development of reporting rules and regulations and the procedures, the standards for doing that internally, nationally within Saudi, is being built bottom up. I mean, regulations are by definition one size that fits all, but it doesn't have to be all the way. I mean, on the high level, yes, maybe, but at the level of detail and level how do you comply, you need to have the freedom and you need to have the say into what makes best sense for you and your own situation. One of the good examples is camel grazing, for example. Camel grazing, uncontrolled camel grazing is one of the stresses on the environment where we exist. Banning camel grazing or building a fence is definitely not the solution. And so you need to work with the camel owners, and you need owning camels is very important into the culture of the locals. So you need to work with them, you need to communicate with them, and you need to find specific solutions that do work with them. We do not have to tell them what they have or do not have to do. We take the solutions from them, and we need to take the needs from them, and then we just become an enabler for them to have a better, more environmentally friendly grazing for their camels. That we can coexist. That giga project, a beautiful environment, that a thriving environment, and also them with the culture, with the camels. All of them can coexist if we just establish that dialogue. And we don't need top-down approaches to enforce any regulations. We need to listen, and we need to develop solutions. When we have the tools, we have the experts to develop those solutions that work for them.
It's a great example of learning from nature and learning from the pre-existing environment that's there. Ben, you're in a highly competitive industry, right? So similarly, how are you thinking about using tech to differentiate yourselves? How do you think about what makes you special in the space?
Yeah, and so we believe that tech and data is going to be the clear enabler. So that's why we've invested so much in both alliances, our own technology development, and supporting external initiatives as well, as I said earlier. So for us, it's about taking enterprise solutions, but we are investing heavily in enabling content, accelerators. You've kind of got a core platform, but the way in which those are used, the examples around sustainability use cases, analytics, workflow, using AI, that's all what you might call partner content, and that's where we're contributing to the agenda.
We have 1 more minute together, so I want to hear from you each very quickly. What's a technology you'd love to see? What's something you would be excited to see growth in the future? Ben, you first.
Well, I wonder what quantum will do. We talk a lot about Gen AI. I mean, quantum could, for a start, cut down massively the emissions footprint of of the energy consumption today of all of the data centers and all the tech, because it's going to be hugely more efficient. But inevitably, how quickly will we then ramp up use? And there'll be a kind of feedback loop and a consequence. So it'll be really interesting to see how, if we can, significantly reduce the emissions of technology through the use of quantum.
Daniel, what about you?
First of all, I actually very much agree with this aspect, but to perhaps not pick on the same one, I would probably more go into the generative AI direction as to how it can develop as an enabler going forward, how it can be fundamental in developing new processes, new ideas as to how we can turn our existing processes more efficient.
Ryan?
For me and for the context in terms of tourism and development, I would love to see technology playing a part that takes us from the very good example that you used in terms of how adding a carbon calculator to when you go and book your flight, to something that really tells the people how are they contributing and how are they interacting with the environment. Knowledge is the key. And if we are able to deliver that knowledge to anybody, to kids, to locals, to Bedouins, to the fishermen, and to everybody, if you are able to deliver that information on its own and to give them the understanding of what's their long-term, measurable, verifiable impact on the environment, behavioral change will happen, and people will change and will choose the right the right option. They will choose to do best for their environment and for their own people. People take care of their home, they take care of each other, and they take care of the environment. We only need to enable that. And if we can have the technology that takes them from a simple calculator or simple add-on to an exercise that they do and makes it part of their life to understand how they interact with the environment over long term, I think that's key for success globally.
Red, Daniel, and Ben, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Please welcome to the stage Dr. Oskar Kahele, Pro Bono Director Europe at DLA Piper, Katrina Mannion, Vice President of Environmental Sustainability at BP, Hannah Newcomb, Co-CEO of Stronger Together, and Joe Webb, Head of Sustainable Procurement at The Body Shop, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Samuel Etienne.
All right, good morning, I'm really happy to be here speaking with you, and we're talking all about supply chains today, in particular ethical supply chains. We're going to stick to the key themes of this overall summit. So first we'll talk about the financial and business case, then we'll talk about tracking and measuring progress within supply chains in terms of looking at it in terms of a whole sector, but also within individual businesses. And then we'll talk about inclusivity towards the end for roughly about 5 minutes. We'll also have roughly 5 to 10 minutes for questions at the end. Before I get going on the financial case for ethical supply chains, I'd like to say we've got an audience poll question, something interactive to keep you awake, all right? So the audience electronic poll question, which should pop up behind me perhaps shortly, is, do you think consumers are willing to pay higher prices to ensure their products are sourced and manufactured ethically? That's the question, all right? It'll be a yes, no, and possibly a depends as well. So that's the question, all right? Do you think consumers are willing to pay a higher price? If you can, answer as soon as possible, and we'll chime back in on it shortly. All right, so I'd like to get going and talk about the financial case for sustainability, right? But before I talk about the financial case, perhaps we should separate that from the business case. And I'd like to bring in Oskar, yourself, a lawyer, to talk about the business case for why sort of ethical supply chains matter in business.
So when we talk about the business case, it's about justification of what we're doing. Why are we doing what we're doing, and how does it, serve us?
serve one way or the other. And when we talk about the business case, there is legal considerations in it, there's financial considerations in it, there's reputational considerations in it. Therefore, a business case is made up of different elements. And when we talk about the business case for sustainability, and when we talk about why do we have to be sustainable, I'd like to a little bit touch upon the legal side, because I'm a lawyer, work for a law firm, and like to give you a little bit background of the legal developments. The whole thing started as corporate social responsibility, which turned into business and human rights, and now we call it ESG.
Yeah.
And ESG is becoming a law as well. It was soft law before, now it's becoming hard law with the EU directives. EU will be followed by other continents and countries, supposedly, hopefully. And we are trying to do something here, which is trying to grasp how we can serve our interests, but at the same time serve the greater community, or serve, all of us together, because we are a part of this world, part of the community. We cannot live alone. We depend on each other. Therefore, while taking care of each other, we need to take care of. While taking care of ourselves, we also need to take care of each other, and trying to get this right. And that's why it's becoming a legal obligation, because we see that it is absolutely necessary. We can't do otherwise. Getting this right is a struggle, and that is the struggle that causes us to question, should we do it, should we not do it, how can we do it, and are we doing it right? And so this is a journey, and then it's supported by legal developments, financial considerations, ethical considerations, and reputational considerations, the demands of the consumers and stuff. But I think this journey is going to continue. We absolutely have to do it. ESG might become something else. We might call it, I don't know, something else down the line in 5-10 years. But it's here to stay. It'll be supported by law, and I think this is the business case for sustainability.
So just to touch upon what Oscar said there, we've got the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, mouthful. They've just agreed upon that, and that's going to be a civil law instrument to hold companies accountable for environmental degradation and human rights abuses. They've just agreed upon the wording for that in June. In Germany, at the start of the year, they put into effect their supply chain law, affecting companies of up to 3,000 people. From June onwards, I think they're working on a law that affects companies of 1,000 people, and this EU directive is looking at companies of 250 or more people. So we've spoken about the business case. I know, Joe, you're particularly keen to talk about the financial case for ethical supply chains.
Well, I'm keen to actually say that we can't talk about the financial case. It's actually about value. And we need to move the narrative from financial to actually value, because we've got to change the narrative to assuming that there's a financial business case to do sustainability. There's not. So I think in terms of why, what is this business case? Obviously for the Body Shop, it's a lot, it's a very simple question, because we're a business that has this as part of our DNA. It's the principle on which Anita Roddick founded the business. So for us, it's part of our purpose, it's part of our DNA. But actually for businesses more generally, not only is it the right thing to do, but as Oscar mentioned, there's the increase in legal, different reputational elements. Investors are looking at this. But actually there's research that shows as well that brands with purpose are actually more profitable, have better customer satisfaction, better market share, grow faster, better future-proofed, and actually attract and retain talent better. So I think it's a whole broader piece for sustainability. And as well, we can't do business on a dying or dead planet.
I saw a few nods there when you said brands are more profitable. And then I saw Katrina nodding massively, and I'm thinking, all right, is BP more profitable thanks to this?
Well, it's interesting because I completely agree about us talking more about the value proposition than necessarily the financial case. The financial case often gives a sense of sort of cost and what's the sort of benefit as associated with that cost. And I think that's quite short term in terms of thinking. And we're a company undergoing a huge transition in a system, in an energy system that is undergoing a huge transition. And what that means is what we define as a customer is changing. And for us, customers are not just the consumer on the forecourt, they're also governments who we want to win successful wind bids from, or they may be our business-to-business customers, such as our car manufacturers who are trying to grow their EV charging fleet, and we need to provide the infrastructure to support that. Or it might be the consumer, and we've recently done a really nice thing with the Humble Coffee Cup, where we've sort of reduced the environmental impact on that, in part due to consumer demand. And I think when we're thinking about ethical supply chains, and actually even the phrase ethical supply chain, when I saw the title of this talk, I thought, gosh, to me in a way that almost feels like an old-fashioned term. And I don't mean that's because it's not absolutely critical, it's just becoming so fundamental to any business. And of course, as Joe says, to Body Shop, you'd think it's core, but I think it's equally as core to BP. And we're thinking about resilience of our supply chains. We're thinking about mitigating risk within that supply chain. And we're in a very complex geopolitical environment. There's lots of different drivers acting on us. And so you really want to consider these issues far beyond what I suppose maybe more traditionally many decades ago, where we just looked at things from a cost perspective. So absolutely, it's a value proposition in my view.
I could see Hannah nodding. I know you're co-CEO at Stronger Together, working at eliminating modern slavery in supply chains. Have you found it a challenge to try and drive home that there is a business case or a financial element to having ethical supply chains?
I think we see that momentum growing, and the legislation that's been referred to has really helped to drive that momentum. We see that that's landing at the board level increasingly with the organisations that we work with. I wanted to respond to a few of the points that have been raised. So on this point around the value chain, I think that's something we definitely talk about within Stronger Together, within the guidance and support we provide to businesses, to see supply chains as value chains, and that value is actually flowing in both directions, down to the individuals working within those value chains, as well as up to, through the businesses and to the consumers that might be using those products and services, and the importance of that resilience and building those partnerships at every level in that value chain as well. I think what that legislation also provides is an opportunity to level the playing field. What we've heard from organisations we work with is some frustrations where they're wanting to operate ethically, but they're having to compete on a playing field with those where perhaps there aren't repercussions for not operating ethically. So legislation with effective enforcement of that legislation does help to level that playing field, and then that offers an opportunity for those businesses to differentiate further and go further to show how they kind of differentiate from the market. And then I think the last point I wanted to respond to was the poll, and interesting to see what the results of that are. Certainly recent research shows consumers are willing to pay more for ethical products, and we know ethical markets are growing from ethical consumers reports that they do each year. But of course, we know we're also in a situation at the moment where there's pressure on price, and so I think it's really important when we think about that value chain that the efforts businesses are making to minimise the impact of that on consumers doesn't undermine their human rights efforts and doesn't have a negative impact on the workers within supply chains, because we know when price is squeezed, that often can have a negative impact on workers within those value chains.
Massively. I'd like to ask an open question to you all. Katrina mentioned sort of how clients are sort of driving a lot of this. Do you think that the changes in place with regard law, we're seeing, if you don't stick to this EU directive, you're going to face a hefty fine. Is that sort of driving the change in ethical supply chains, or is it client and consumer demand for more ethical supply chains? Which do you think it is?
I mean, I'm happy to come in on that, actually. I mean, I think it's an easy answer to say it's all of the above, but I genuinely believe that to be true.
One more than the other.
But to give an example, so for example, in my area, I work a lot in environmental sustainability. I'm really interested in circular solutions within the supply chain. Certainly, particularly in our new business areas, we are seeing it's not that it gives you a benefit. It's if you want to actually play the game, if you want entry to that market, you have to have access to innovative, sustainable, looking at sort of end-of-life solution suppliers in order for you to actually just participate. So it's almost just becoming the baseline for which you're expected to work in. Similarly, if I think about coming back to that coffee cup example I gave earlier, there are driving forces. There's an EU Packaging Waste Directive coming through, which is encouraging, our EU businesses to look at recyclable materials and think about what you're providing to the customer. But at the same time, we were getting that pull from the consumer within many of our European markets. And when we actually looked at, and I'll use a coffee cup because it's an easy example, and I'll remember the facts associated with it. But we did a very simple thing of reducing the cardboard associated with that. It reduced the amount of cardboard boxes we needed to transport it, therefore reduced the amount of fleet we needed, so it was 50% less trucks needed, carbon emission saving, cost saving. So it can unlock innovation, but it's probably any one of those drivers alone might not be sufficient, but all of them collectively helps really sort of push that agenda forward.
Okay, interesting.
Oh, sorry.
You've got a point? No, jump
I was
in,
just
Jo.
going to jump
Go for
in
it.
because I'd say I'd agree, but I don't think it's necessarily binary, who's driving it, the business or the consumer. Actually, I think for customers and business, there's almost like three layers. If we think about business, there's the ones who are doing this before any legislation. Then there's those who are bought into it because, the legislation has come about and they're complying with it. And then there's others who kind of need to be bought kicking and screaming. And that's probably the same with consumers. You're always going to have the innovators, the ones who are leading, those who, as it starts to get more mainstream, and then hopefully we get to the place where this is just commonplace and, there is no choice, not choice, but, that it's embedded throughout everything anyway.
Yeah, it's not ethical supply chains, it's just supply chains.
Exactly.
And they're all ethical.
And before we move on to I just want to emphasize what you said, Jo. I mean, there are innovators in this space, and I think they are the ones driving this agenda. They are the ones deciding what the standards are going to be. And the legislation is going to come always in the middle, meaning set the minimum standards and try to catch those who are not compliant, but also will follow the lead of the innovators in order to improve the legislation further. And those innovators I think, are really important and doing a really crucial job in identifying what needs to be done, how it needs to be done, and where are we going from here. So they need to be uploaded, supported, looked up to, and also they have big responsibility on their shoulders, and they are taking this seriously, obviously. But if companies would like to have a stake at the table and decide how this should be done, then they need to be innovators. I mean, just following the legislation makes you a sheep, and this will also have consequences for the future sustainability of your business, because that means you're reactive. You're not thinking ahead and planning ahead.
I agree, Oscar, if I can jump in.
Yeah.
But also I feel that sometimes if people aren't forced, and if there isn't a financial penalty for not doing something, then more often than not, people will just carry on regardless, right? Very quickly, I want to move on to tracking and measuring progress in this space, right? Maybe a year ago, maybe longer, do you remember when everyone was talking about the blockchain? Yeah, blockchain in supply chains. Yeah, we're going to measure this on the blockchain. Yeah, we're going to be able to measure everything and track everything, and it's going to be brilliant. I don't hear much about the blockchain anymore. How are we going to track and measure progress in sort of ethical supply chains, either within individual businesses or within sort of the big picture, ethical supply chains as a whole? Is it sort of looking at any key metrics or any key data? Do you have any examples perhaps you can share from your own experiences? I'll start with yourself, Jo.
Yeah, I think there's two things. First of all, there's the data, and then there's the technology or the platforms or whatever. From a data perspective, obviously, you need to have a data strategy, but also you need to make sure that you've got systemized and structured data. It's not just stuck in spreadsheets where no one looks at it. It is something that's guided by your targets, that you're measuring it year on year. And it's data that's actually going to make an impact and that you are actually going to do something with. So rather than sort of bombard suppliers with multiple data requests, make sure it's actually something that you're going to, act on. And I would probably say as well, build it into your existing processes, because it needs to be embedded in the business. It needs to be hardwired into the way that you do business in terms of your existing processes. Otherwise, there'll be more resistance internally. Yeah. So, and from our side as the Body Shop, we actually have sort of social and environmental goals set as our business objectives, cascading into personal objectives. So whatever role that you have in the business, whether you're in marketing, in procurement, in brand, you still get to have something that drives a social and environmental impact. And then in terms of sort of platforms themselves, there's a proliferation of platforms, and that can be counterproductive. So I think we also need to think about, what are the industry standards, what are common platforms or common data points, so that we're not just creating a never-ending cycle of reporting rather than actually, creating impact.
Loads of data, little action, right?
Exactly.
Hannah.
Yeah, well, I wanted to echo a number of the points that Jo made there. I think that starting with setting those targets and objectives and that being fully integrated into overall company performance and having that, board level commitment to those targets. But that then has to flow through into actually measuring consistently against those, and if progress is slow in some areas, looking at, well, what are the root causes, why is that slow, and trying to fix those causes. And I think something we really promote from a human rights perspective within Stronger Together is how you move from outputs to outcomes and actually see what's been the change. So a very practical example, because you said as something we do is around supporting businesses on responsible recruitment, modern slavery. So not just measuring, well, this many people have attended a training on responsible recruitment practices. It's actually what did that lead to in terms of improved practices within the business, and what's that led to in terms of better worker satisfaction, reduced instances of exploitation within the supply chain. So how can businesses get to that point of actually seeing the change that their interventions have had? And then, there are a range of tools to support you. Stronger Together provides a number of those kind of self-assessment tools that bring, different sectors together to kind of see what change they're making as a group of peers and how they might be able to collaborate to respond to some of those common challenges within their supply chains.
Interesting. When you say tools, what do you mean?
So we have like a range of, at a basic practical level, it could be an offline checklist that a business can use within an individual site to see what kinds of things are we doing to support individuals to know the signs of exploitation, know what to do if they see it and how to report that sensitively, how to remediate if that happens, through to larger online kind of self-assessment, progress monitoring tools that then kind of aggregate that data. And as I say, we can then use those trends to see, well, what things are businesses doing really well on and what things are businesses finding quite challenging, which is often things like grievance mechanisms, how to appropriately respond, how to provide remedy, and then we can tailor our support and training and guidance to the things that businesses are finding more challenging.
Okay, that's useful.
I was going to come in there actually, because I don't know if we're doing everything that you've just mentioned, but we're certainly doing some of those things to maybe bring it to life. So we have a group-wide target around labour rights and modern slavery that by 2025, 100% of our high-risk suppliers are assessed against labour rights and modern slavery principles that we set in 2019. So I think kind of to to your point around checklist, it sets out our expectations of suppliers, and it's things like you shouldn't have passport retention, excessive work hours, recruitment fees should be paid by the employer, not the employee, a whole range of different expectations that we put on our suppliers who help us with our contractor workforce. But when we, go and investigate and do audits and check on that, obviously we sometimes, unfortunately, will uncover things that aren't abiding by those principles. And it's actually those interventions that yield some of the most sort of richest results. And, one area we've really been focusing on is open talk and grievance. So do people feel safe to raise concerns? So we have a hotline that anyone working for us or in our contractor workforce can anonymously call and report. And I've seen it myself, people will email us directly, which is an amazing thing. When I see that, I'm thinking, thank God, that means you feel it's safe to do that.
I was going to ask Katrina, how do you measure whether people feel safe or not, right?
Yeah.
Probably through the numbers of people reaching out to you.
Exactly, and that is it's not an ideal metric because that is just an output, and obviously you can't measure the people who don't feel safe.
Yeah.
So a lot of it has to be site conversations, really talking to the workers there to understand what their experience is.
I'd like to move on very quickly to our final point and bring Oscar in on it, and it's to do with inclusivity, right? Which is essentially the final point on this summit. You've got these supply chains. Very often you've got some vendors, quite small, the little people in the supply chain, very easy for the little people to get exploited. How do we ensure that their voice is heard, that they're taken seriously by some of these massive companies?
Before inclusivity, I just had a point to add. Can I go back to this?
Very quickly, in a minute, Oscar.
I'll come back to it. So in terms of using technology for supply chain, I was reading the history of supply chain. Apparently, barcode is what made supply chain what it is today. And 80% of the world's trade depends on supply chain. So it's kind of like barcode changed the supply chain. And what is going to be the next thing that could, next technology that could change supply chain? Change supply chain, I was thinking. And I read some reviews about Internet of Things. So Internet of Things could also bring us to the inclusivity point, because it's about communicating with people, getting real-time information, understanding the problem, and then bringing solutions to it, actually. And if we would like to be inclusive, we would like to we would need to be able to know what's going on and have systems in place to respond to that and understand the scale of the problem and understand and give people safe spaces to communicate this information. And the technology problem, coming back to the blockchain, technology problem for the supply chain is not a problem of what is out there and how can we use it. It's about designing what I want and then look out the tools and say, which one of those tools can do what I want? And that is the real challenge here, because we are trying to design what we want and how we want it, and so that it's not too overwhelming, but it's useful and to manage this information. So hopefully I managed to answer both of your questions in 1 minute.
You did. You cut the time down by doing 2 in 1. I like it. All right, so earlier on we asked this question, right? In our audience electronic poll. Do you think consumers are willing to pay higher prices to ensure their products are sourced and manufactured ethically? It would be great to see the answers or know about the answers if we can. Here we go. So 52% of you say it depends on the products. Which makes sense, right? And then 26% say yes, and 22% say no, which is quite interesting. If you look at the current economic climate, inflation at 30-year, 40-year record highs, that also makes sense. We've touched upon inclusivity. Is there a very quick point, in less than a minute, any of you want to make on that? I'll take Hannah just now.
Well, I would like to ensure that the worker voice piece is recognised within that context of inclusivity. We've already talked about ensuring grievance mechanisms are trusted, understood, also predictable, so workers know what actually will happen if I raise an issue through this mechanism. But also, what are those wider ways of actively involving workers within the design of human rights and environmental programs? So wider feedback channels, committees, surveys. We've talked about technology. There's a range of different apps to enable workers to kind of understand information.
If I could interject, Hannah. So Joe at the Body Shop, would you have an app or questionnaire for some of your vendors who produce some of the products that you source globally? Does that work?
Well, we're a member of Stronger Together, so
okay,
yes,
nice.
we use a number of platforms already. I think Hannah's raised the point about how do you hear from workers specifically.
Yeah.
So I think I won't repeat the sort of grievance mechanisms, channels, etc. But I do think actually you need to practice what you preach.
Yeah.
So you can't ask suppliers to do something that you're not doing yourself. So, we have inclusion hubs within the business. We have an inclusive hiring program, which really just strips back, how you actually get a job. It's in the UK and Australia. We work with our community fair trade program. It's our bespoke fair trade program with producers, marginalised producer groups on the ground. And we embed inclusion, diversity and inclusion into how we award and ongoing monitor suppliers as well. So yes, there's apps, but it's much more than just that.
Yeah. I hope that's been useful for our audience here. We do probably have time for a quick question, one or two. Do we have any questions from the audience, just to conclude here?
Do one question here. In the U.S., we've recently seen ESG backlash and companies walk back their ESG commitments. How do you bridge the gap between that and the new EU ESG directives and regulations?
It's a very good question. I see Katrina nodding.
I say that's a great question. I wish I knew the
BP
answer.
straddles multiple time zones, so perhaps you could answer that.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a fantastic question because I think it demonstrates some of the challenges global business is trying to navigate. We are in 60 countries, we have 40,000 suppliers, many other facts I could mention. I think what we try and do is remain core to our ambitions and our purpose, which we've been very sort of vocal and clear about and transparent about over the last few years. And I think in some ways, I think the direction of travel is fairly clear from everything we've discussed already. I'm seeing that maybe as a wrinkle rather than a change in direction. So I think overall we need to really just think about long-term sustainability and resilience. The path is set.
I think to that point as well, it's important that the people pushing legislation within certain trading blocks, like the new EU directive, speak with the likes of the SEC, who are putting together their carbon disclosure, and that all of these different regulators and trading blocks work together so that there's no mismatch between different geographical zones.
And there is some good movements where people are trying to standardize. I know you've got TNFD on the panel later this afternoon. We're trying to have more consistencies in framework and reporting and disclosure requirements, and that certainly helps. So if there are anyone listening from governments, please do continue along that line. That definitely helps us.
Perfect. I think that's a good point to conclude on. Thank you for taking part, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Suzanne Barker, Strategy Partner at AMV BBDO, Sylvia Maurer, Director for Sustainability, Energy, Food, Health and Safety at the European Consumer Organization, and Jonathan White, Climate Accountability Lawyer at Client Earth, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Olivia Rudgard.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you to our panelists for coming.
Right, and also sometimes.
So we're going to talk today about greenwashing. So the most consumer end of greenwashing. So how consumers are being misled or otherwise by claims in the media and advertising by companies. So we've got a really interesting panel. Before we kick off, we've got a poll question, and I want you to think about the question. You can vote. Here's the question, and as we're talking about it, I want you to you can vote, and what our panelists say will inform it. So it's what key measures should we focus on to reduce cases of greenwashing? And we've got some options here, better rules, independent verification, more specific categories, so you can think about that as we're talking. So We've got a lot of great perspectives here from industry and from the kind of consumer regulation side. So I want to start with Sylvia. Can we talk about, what are we talking about when we talk about greenwashing? What are some of the examples that you've seen in your work?
I think greenwashing is actually when companies overstate in their rhetoric what is a product or a service not offering to consumers in terms of sustainability in reality. And with climate change, which is happening just in front of our eyes, there are more and more consumers who in their daily choices, of course, want to make also better choices. And the more they look for credible and substantiated information, the more they find out that they are in a jungle of misleading green claims. And it doesn't matter if they want to buy a package of milk or new shoes or trousers, cosmetics, or subscribe to a new energy contract or invest in financial services. The information for the moment is just not clear, and in many cases it's doubtful and it's not substantiated.
Mm-hmm. And what's the problem with that? Why is that a problem kind of from a legal or also sort of a regulatory point of view? Jonathan, maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah, sure. Well, essentially that kind of advertising these days in particular represents a clear and present legal risk. The law has always said that that communication needs to be substantiated. Environmental communication is no different. And what is new, I think, is the realization that's behind a lot of the regulation and regulatory moves, which is that actually this stuff has an impact on transition. The link between transition and misleading advertising is increasingly well understood, and the strategies that actually can block transition are increasingly charted by regulators and by the IPCC, for example.
Mm-hmm. And Suzanne, how do you find that coming through in your work with clients? Are you finding that people are wanting that green messaging coming through increasingly, and how are they then being challenged by the regulatory pressure?
Greenwashing is such a hot topic. So working at an ad agency like BBDO, we have had a crazy good 2 years where every brand in the building is coming to us to say we need to talk about what we're doing when it comes to sustainability. We're committed to it, but we need to tell consumers what we stand for. And we have had such a time trying to figure out and work with clients about how do we tell their story? What can they actually say? Do they have their house in order? How do we then think about how do we communicate with that, whether that's a headline or a claim, or if it's an external piece of comms like a TV commercial? How do we help them figure out how they can say it? And the reality is we've had to really upskill our entire industry to be able to understand how you actually talk about these things. I think it's one thing for us to be able to sell chocolate. It's another thing for us to understand really the complexity of something like a cocoa supply chain, to tell consumers about do you have ethically sourced chocolate, for example. And I think really we have a big job to do to continually upskill, work with partners like here on the stage and kind of say, what can we say, what can't we say? And if we're facing regulation, we need to support it and understand maybe there's different ways for us to tell our stories. And that's something really exciting in the branding space. The public sector has such a big role to play when they want to talk about what they're doing as a company to help with sustainability. Maybe there's other ways we can help them advertise and talk about them in new ways.
Can you talk a bit more about that? Is
sure, yes.
Going beyond the kind of advertising picture into something a bit more sort of proactive? Or
yes. So, last week was the Cannes Lion International Festival of Creativity. And I have to give a lot of credit to InBev, who came out with a lot of work on Corona beer. Corona beer has a lot of issues that they care about, one of them being kind of plastic pollution and ocean pollution. And they had, I think, over 25 entries of different kind of bold acts or big stunts they were doing to kind of help figure out how they can kind of help that core of the environment. And so instead of doing necessarily a TV commercial, they're saying, what are the things that we can do actually that have real world impact? One of the examples that is really hot right now is a Corona plastic fishing tournament, where they got basically, fishermen around the world to then go hunt for plastic. That's an interesting way to tell your story. And I think that's an interesting way to say, okay, maybe we can't do a TV commercial about it because of the legalities, but maybe we can actually do something even better, which is going out in the world to actually do something about the problem that we're committed to solving.
That's really interesting. Yeah, so we actually have a chart. We can illustrate some of the demand that's coming through both from business and from consumers. This is the growth in the number of EU eco-labeled products. So you can really see the industries wanting to communicate to consumers that their products have those credentials. So that's really interesting. So in terms of the consumer, what are some of the ways that confusion is manifesting itself? Are we kind of seeing people kind of buying products that are not as green as they think they are? Is that one of the big concerns here? And what is the impact of that on net zero goals, for example?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'm very happy to see that chart and that evolution, because the EU eco-label is one of the best ways on how you can communicate to consumers about the sustainability of products and services, like tourism, for example, because it's a label of environmental excellence. You look at the criteria over the whole life cycle, and you cannot just address one little item, which unfortunately many companies do. They focus on one aspect of the product, and this is really a holistic concept. And that's why it's also so important we act against misleading and unsubstantiated green claims, because in order to get the EU eco-label, you need to bring some evidence, and that's why it's credible for consumers. You can compare products across the board that have the eco-label, and you can just make better choices. It's also being revised over time, so it becomes more and more ambitious. And that's not the case for many of the claims we think that companies make that are not adhering to such third-party accredited schemes, where you also need to verify your evidence. And that's something where we think the European Commission should act and take more activities to make sure that we can clean up some of the misleading green claims. In the health sector, we have been doing that. You know, some years ago, there were suddenly messages like this margarine is good for your cholesterol and this yogurt is good for, I don't know. And once the companies had to bring evidence and it has independently been checked, a lot of the claims had to be taken off the market because they just could not be substantiated. And in the environment, we need to do something similar, and that's why we also want to just outright ban certain claims that you can probably never substantiate. Like if something is carbon neutral, I mean a carbon neutral banana, does it exist? It's maybe too good to be true, I don't know. But every consumption has also an impact.
Yeah, I was reading, there was a story that came out just this morning about Nestle changing its mind about some of the offsetting claims it was going to make, carbon neutrality claims, because they were reliant on offsets. And so is that a particularly big legal risk, the kind of the offsetting thing with the climate that we have now for around, you know, some of the controversy around offsetting and how effective it is?
Yeah, I'd say it is. I mean, there's a rash of challenges by regulators, by competitors, by consumer ombudsman, and by NGOs against those sorts of claims that are in various jurisdictions around the world. And the point, of course, ultimately is it's a way of selling a dirty product that's green, which doesn't exist. And that's the heart of the kind of misleadingness of it. And I think that there is possibly even going to be stricter rules at the regulatory level on those precise claims, which would be, in our view, better than kind of relying on enforcement down the line to pick up the pieces.
Yeah. I want to sort of get into the jurisdictional element of this a little bit as well, because there are lots of different regulators around the world acting in different ways. You know, is anyone in particular a leader, and how are they kind of acting, and how are others responding?
Yeah, I think the one thing that's very interesting about this area, legally speaking, is that it is extremely common. It's uniform in the sense that the basic rule that environmental claims have to be backed up with environmental evidence, not by market practice, not by good feelings or ambition, but by actual objective evidence, which means usually environmental evidence, is found in multiple jurisdictions, as far as I've found anyway. And I think that that basic rule means that the sort of greenwashing regulatory landscape is going to be very similar. You'll have countries moving faster along the route of enforcing the law against it, and some moving slower. But what we've seen in particular in, for example, the UK, is that the advertising regulator there has really taken the UK's net zero targets as part of the necessary basis for its work. And it sees the environmental impacts of certain kinds of particularly high carbon advertising, and is therefore focusing on those.
And I mean, you talked a bit about the European Commission and the way it's acting. I mean, is the regulation strong enough in this area? Does there need to be, I mean, not to preempt the answer to the poll question, but would a stronger penalty maybe kind of improve their ability to respond to false green claims or misleading green claims?
We certainly need a stronger legislative framework on green claims. As I said, you should have something similar like in the health claims area, in the sense that you should bring evidence as a company before you put a claim on the market. It should be transparent what the criteria are, and it should ideally also be checked, like in the case of the EU eco-label, what the evidence is and if it's credible. So there the EU is undertaking legislation which we very much welcome. But I wanted to make also another point. What is also very important is that we will have more enforcement at the national level, because unfair green claims are already today forbidden under the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive in the EU. It's just not always clear what that means. And also you go on a case-by-case basis and you go country per country, whereas the marketing campaigns are often global or across countries in the EU with the exact same slogans and the same techniques. And we just need to become also more efficient and effective in those areas to be quicker, because the harm is then already being done. The claims are there, the consumers buy the products, and if they find out afterwards that something, or they have been misled, they are also losing confidence. And that is not what we need in the current situation. Ideally, consumers also in the future would not have the choice anymore between an unsustainable and a sustainable product. If we want to master that climate crisis, we need to make sure that this is becoming the norm, basically. And if I may, on the carbon offsetting, maybe also to say that one area where we are looking very closely besides food is for the moment also the aviation sector. So consumer groups in the EU have submitted a complaint to the European Commission and to the national consumer protection authorities to investigate that sector. Because consumers have been misled, they're also being asked to pay a certain amount on the ticket for offsetting, but it can be like a very low fee. You do not know in how far that actually helps the environment. And we think that there is some scrutiny urgently needed, and maybe consumers should even get their money back that they have been overspending. Yeah,
that's really interesting. I always find it interesting that these airlines ask the consumer to pay that extra more. You know, it seems like an interesting decision-making process to say, oh, you know, you're paying £50 for your ticket, just add a little bit more, and you kind of think, well, shouldn't that be part of the product that I buy? Shouldn't it be a sustainable product already? It's an interesting one from a consumer perspective.
And if I may jump in on that, actually, I think in terms of the sort of the landscape that Sylvia describes, with the need for enforcement to be scaled up and resourced, what we see is that really clear, specific rules at the sort of the start of the process are needed. For example, just clarifying that the effect of the law really is that highly polluting industries like fossil fuel industries simply are going to struggle to produce sustainability claims that comply with the environmental evidence, given that that's so damning. And I think that kind of clarity would be really useful, just to cut through and provide a little bit of a steer in this landscape.
Yeah, and we've seen fossil fuel companies in the UK being hit by this misleading by emission idea that the ASA has been really pushing recently, which, as you say, is really making it difficult. I think they might argue. I mean, that's an interesting one for you, actually. You know, if you have a contract with somebody who does that type of work and they want to, promote their they're building solar panels or whatever, how do you then manage that? You know, how do you thread that needle, and is it even possible to do green advertising?
It's a massive question, right? I think any client that we have, we want to help them be able to tell their story, but it starts with them having a story to tell. And if their story is dubious or not clear or ambiguous, you know, we're either going to make the decision not to work with them, or we think that we can play a clear role to help them. I think, you know, this discussion too is really interesting, because a lot of times there's so many regulatory bodies that we have to now follow in terms of what we can say, but generally when we get back something on an ad, it's a lot of red tape of saying you can't say this because of it, but instead no one's saying, but you can, and what if you thought about this? Or we need people to work with us to be able to tell the claims in different ways. We want to follow the rules, but we also want to give an opportunity for these brands that are sometimes doing really good things to be able to figure it out. You know, and I think too, you had Paul Pullman on earlier from Unilever, and he talks a lot about courage. And there's something too where we're seeing this thing where, you know, 2 years ago, everyone was so excited to kind of scream from the rooftops about what they're doing about sustainability. And now people are so worried about greenwashing and now green hushing, which means they don't even want to say anything at all, that they've now kind of pushed them stuff back. But it takes courage for these brands to say, listen, there's going to be regulatory bodies. We need to listen to them because they're doing the right thing. But let's think about how we can be creative in our solution, and also how we can make sure what we're doing is something that's translatable to customers. Because I think the other thing too, right, is we're so caught in this bubble of kind of this sustainability language, and we talk about it every day here, but the average consumer has no idea what we're talking about, and so there's a big education piece to help them understand, if you have a claim, what that means, what should they be looking for. You know, I think right now when you look at, you know, packaging, to your point earlier, They have little things on the packaging that might say stuff, but the average consumer probably doesn't actually know what that means. So there's a big job to do to kind of, I think, help translate what big brands are doing, how they can tell that message to consumers, and then how we work with regulatory bodies to make sure we're doing it in the most ethical way possible.
Mm-hmm. And the regional differences as well. I mean, presumably you have global clients. To what extent is this a question that you have for clients who are coming out of China, for example? I mean, is greenwashing an issue? I actually don't know. Like, do you have that type of issue there, or is it a very US, Europe?
I don't have the data in the back of my head, but I think generally in terms of the brands that we work on around the world, the majority of sustainability briefs we're getting are happening in Europe. So our UK office is in data with them, and more so than getting briefs in the US or China. So Europe is definitely leading the charge. I think you probably use data to support that Chinese consumers, for example, don't necessarily either know enough about sustainability or think that's the top tier choice of why they're going to purchase something. So there's a long way to do, but it's exciting that Europe can kind of lead that charge and help those other countries as and when.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I want to unpack this idea of green hushing a little bit as well. I mean, to what extent is that a big problem? To what extent is that something that regulators should be really concerned about when they're regulating in this area? Should they be really aware of it, or is it just a sort of, a cynic might say, oh well, they would say that, it's just a way to protest against being cracked down upon. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I think the concept of green hushing really, and the question of whether actually regulators ought to not enforce the law, is basically tantamount to saying there ought to be an exception in the law for sustainability claims, and that's simply not where the policy is going. It is going in the opposite direction. There's much more rigor being enforced in the claims. It's worth highlighting again that just the existing law has always required that claims need to be backed up by evidence. Mm-hmm. It's simply there's been a huge enforcement gap of that, which is understandable given the information asymmetry between the environmental evidence and regulators and all this. So I think just generally the kind of the reason those laws exist is to try and ensure truth in commerce, and I've not seen anyone seriously suggest that there ought to be an exemption to that for sustainability reasons. The second thing I'll just draw attention to is that it's important to have in mind the distinction between corporate reporting and public advertising. Right. So public advertising is public advertising. In the corporate reporting space, I wouldn't say that green hushing is at all relevant, for the simple reason that we're moving as a broad shift from kind of a voluntary reporting model to a mandatory regulated reporting model. So it won't be a decision as to whether to disclose targets. Investors have been calling that for quite a long time, and so a lot of companies have, but it's going to be legally required to do it, and in quite a lot of detail in the EU, in the UK, the SEC is looking at similar rules. So I think in some senses, the concept of green hushing as regards the main stakeholders for businesses is just redundant or a bit of a red herring in that sense.
Mm-hmm. How much of a concern do you think it is for European consumers? If they're seeking out sustainability-related information, it needs to be there. So if advertisers become afraid of even making claims, it becomes difficult. Or how much of a concern do you think it really is?
Well, first of all, I think any innovation that makes products more sustainable is very much welcome, irrespective of whether you communicate about them or not. That's the starting point. And every company that makes true efforts are making important contributions. I think for consumers, the better information is, as I said, if it's credible and comparable and truthful. And then you also allow those companies who can actually show that their products live up to what the companies are communicating is true. You build confidence, and that's protecting also the ones that invest in that area. If we have unfair competition also between companies who just say they have green products, but they're not so green, then you are also not channeling the consumer investment in the companies that should be rewarded for their efforts. Mm-hmm. So I think that's also why companies should partly think in their campaigns, what tools do I use to communicate to consumers? And there sometimes it's more than only telling a story about the company, but maybe just saying, okay, I want to subscribe to the European Eco label, for example, and then it's something that has been certified and it's known to consumers.
Mm-hmm. I mean, do you think that there are some companies that will, one of the calls from campaigners is that advertising agencies should just refuse to take on business from some companies? I mean, is that something that we're going to start to see? Is it happening already in the industries? They're going to even struggle to get somebody to make their advertising campaigns for them?
Yes. I think so. I think we have to be bold, and we have to have a lot of courage, and we have to say no to, it needs to be planet over profit, right? And you need to make sure that the organizations you're working with are sound. Half of my brain does not feel bad, but you need to help those companies that aren't there yet. And so I think it is going to be tricky about how agencies work with those companies, because they do deserve to be helped and they need a lot of help. So who's going to help them? I think that question remains to be seen, but I don't think we can totally ignore them, but I think we can be really choiceful and mindful. And again, if we have clients that we're working with that want to talk about something and we say that's just not true or you don't have a story to tell, we have to say no. So you have to be really strict and help them kind of, again, planet over profit is the most important thing we can do.
Mm-hmm. It must be a tricky conversation to have sometimes with some clients.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, well, we can look at the results of the poll question to see what the audience thinks is the, there you go, so standardized rules is winning out there, stricter penalties, independent verification, and then specific definitions of sustainability. I mean, I suppose the two are sort of linked, right? It's more clarity, right, is what that's suggesting. I mean, do you think it's quite similar to what you were saying, right? It's having the certainty before you even go out and do something that, about what you can and can't say. Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, well, just to wrap up then, I suppose we can talk about the future now and what we might expect to see next. I mean, what's the next big thing? We've seen a whole range of ASA cases in the UK, for example. The FTC is updating its green guides. The European Commission is looking at this. What are some of the trends that we might expect to see over the next sort of 5 to 10 years that we haven't seen yet in this space?
So I think, if you don't mind if I jump in first on that one, I guess I think it's really important to sort of step back a little bit and think about the role of information in transition, essentially, and to think about what role sort of public behavioural change plays in that, and it plays a big role, but not the only role. And look at other alternatives. There's a lot of expert bodies, for example, in the UK and elsewhere, have looked at past examples of successful and unsuccessful behavioural change that involves big change in consumption and demand and shifts. And it's looking at things like high fat, salt and sugar foods. It's looking at things like pensions auto-enrollment, and in particular at tobacco. And the main lesson of that is really that if you are serious about having that transition actually moving on, then you need a holistic sort of removal of corporate influence that pushes against it for the commodities and goods that you need to decline. And I think that realization is what's really behind the movements that we see a lot in the local and national level for prohibitions, just flat out prohibitions on fossil fuel advertising, basically modeled on the Tobacco Framework Convention and all the work that was done around the harms of tobacco, similar to the harms of fossil fuels. I think that is really where this starts to go.
Okay, great. I think that's a good point to end on, if that's okay with everyone. Thank you so much. Thanks to the audience, and that's the end of our panel. Thanks.
I have a couple of lunch instructions, so you might just want to stick around for 1 second, and then we will get to our lunch break. That obviously wraps our morning program. For those of you who did pre-register for the EY workshop, a technology-led transition, driving decarbonization and a sustainable future, that is going to be down on the ground floor. So if you just take these stairs down 1 level to 6, there will be folks to guide you to take the elevators to the ground floor. That will kick off at 12:45, so pretty soon. And there will be lunch served down there if you're doing that lunch. For everyone else, we will have lunch just outside. We are also going to be doing what we call our kind of designated networking, facilitated networking program, which will kick off around 1:15. So we'll have 3 different topics. You basically just pick the topic that you are most interested in, find the area with the sign, with the moderator, and you'll just have a chance to chat with other people that are interested in that same topic as well. So our topics are sustainable finance, energy transitions, and diversity and inclusion. Also, one thing to mention, if you are interested in a complimentary Bloomberg News subscription, we do have folks outside just to the right here that you can talk to and sign up for that as well during the break. We will be back in here at 2 o'clock with the CEO of Virgin Atlantic, Shai Weiss. So we will see you back here then. Thank you so much.